Chapter 111. Something terrible. Tendrils of dark mist enveloped Northern's body as glistening black tapes deftly wove themselves around his form. For a fleeting moment, he could scarcely discern what was unfolding, despite his eyes clearly observing the shimmering obsidian ribbons dancing across his skin. An intricate, mechanized black armor composed of segmented onyx metal plates slithered into place over his pale flesh, bestowing an angular, futuristic aesthetic. The ebon steel plating possessed an almost supernatural luster, the surfaces so infinitely dark they seemed to absorb all light. The suit enveloped much of Northern's body, revealing an imposing visage. Across various sections, glowing azure energy conduits emanated an eerie radiance. These illuminated lines followed the contours and geometric patterns of the armor, accentuating its sharp facets. On the chest area, a pair of larger glowing blue elements stood out prominently, reminiscent of a dragon's smoldering eyes. Additional armored pieces adorned his shoulders, forearms, and a tail curled out of his lower body. The helmet seamlessly fused with the neckpiece, two vicious horns twisting forth from its crown. Four eerie blue eyes, alight with an unsettling glow, gazed out upon their surroundings. Northern flexed his fingers, assessing any potential restrictions to his mobility. Smooth. Apart from its ethereal lightness, the armor moved with him like a second skin, sleek and unencumbering. If anything, his movements felt more fluid than usual. With a mere thought, Northern dismissed the helmet. They folded inward with practiced efficiency, coalescing into a collar at his neckline while those two devilish horns remained affixed to his head. Unable to visually confirm their presence, his fingers traced the lustrous curves. Crap, am I a devil now? Northern surveyed his environs once more, intending to explore one final facet of his newfound abilities. However, an anomalous occurrence disrupted his plans. Someone entered the chamber he occupied in reality, and for some inexplicable reason, he could sense their presence. Dismissing the night terror armor, he postponed further experimentation. For now, he needed to assess this unusual situation. Thus, he transitioned back to the plane of reality, gently opening his eyes. For the first few minutes after regaining consciousness, Northern kept his eyes firmly shut, steadying his breathing to avoid any noticeable changes from his unconscious state. Even the slightest variation in his respiration pattern had caused the woman seated beside his bed to swiftly turn her head. But upon perceiving no further fluctuations with his eyes closed, she sighed and looked away. As perceptive as ever, he mused inwardly. He needed no visual confirmation to identify her. The lingering scent of alcohol and fiery vermilion tresses were unmistakable. He felt an unexpected swell of relief that Instructor Annette was the first to greet him upon awakening. I suppose I've truly returned home, eh? After Annette departed, Northern opened his eyes and sat upright, momentarily closing them once more before surveying his surroundings. Nothing particularly remarkable. His bed sat central within the modest chamber, dilapidated furnishings scattered haphazardly. The floor and walls were constructed of interlocked brick. A solitary window to his left filtered in meager rays through white-veiled curtains, casting minimal illumination into one corner while shrouding the rest in shadow. Darkness held no impediment for Northern's sight. His perception of the world remained unparalleled and constant, transcending mere light and dark. He could also sense his environs, though this wasn't a feature of all eyes. Perhaps an effect of his attributes. Or simply his newfound ability to manipulate void essence had granted such discernment. His very physicality felt lighter now. It could be due to the evolution. Northern pondered briefly before his thoughts drifted to the number of individuals he sensed nearby. Breathing patterns and footsteps provided the telltale signs. Why are there so many people here? The question nagged internally. I suppose I should investigate, he murmured, rising cautiously and slipping out the door. Peering out first to ensure the corridor was clear, Northern emerged into a dimly lit, narrow hallway with regularly spaced doors lining the walls, undoubtedly more private quarters. The layout was familiar, reminiscent of structures he had inhabited before being relocated to the tower. If I follow this path, I should reach the exterior. His intention was to ascertain precisely how many individuals occupied this place, a curiosity piqued upon initially waking and sensing the multitude of respirations and footfalls. After a brief sojourn, Northern emerged onto a balcony protruding from the main throne hall's upper levels. It seemed a vantage point from which a sovereign would address their subjects. A troubled frown creased his features as an unorthodox, perplexing scene unfolded before him. What is this? Makeshift tents sprouted haphazardly across the immense chamber's floor while huddled groups conversed in tattered attire. Some drifted toward the exit, their purpose unclear. Why are there so many people here? He mentally stammered, gripping the balcony's edge as trepidation blossomed. Northern had been certain departing the rift would return him to his home. Being sent there without consent implied he would be promptly returned upon completing that objective. Or so he'd always assumed. Yet now, his heart quailed as a disquieting premonition took root, that something far worse may have transpired. He could even discern individuals around his age, familiar faces from their academy entrance day. All of them looked ragged, rough, with different patches of metal plates adorning their forms. Some he could perceive were strong and others, not worth his attention. At a glance, he spotted a black-haired girl garbed in black armor with a crimson cloak striding beside a white-haired companion in a sleek white ensemble. The latter's gaze suddenly met his before the raven-tressed woman followed suit. Northern's expression contorted into a horrified scowl. Crap. Something is horribly wrong here. I can feel it. Something terrible has happened. *112 Do not buy. Elliot stared at the sterile white ceiling as he struggled for each labored breath. The incessant beeping of the machinery barely keeping him alive seemed more disruptive than usual. Ever since his lung cancer diagnosis, he had lived each day battling the merciless disease, clinging to the hope that he might prevail. But for those who cannot afford it, hope can be a dangerous thing to cling to. And Elliot was realizing that too young. He blamed it all on his workplace. An esteemed engineer and valedictorian, intelligence was an understatement for his brilliant and creative mind. But he had been naive, falling for the wrong woman and taking the wrong job under her ruthless father. Her father was excavating gold from a perilous site, and needed to hide the operation. Building an oil rig provided the perfect cover. While it was under construction, the gold could be hastily extracted without arousing government suspicion. Elliot's ingenious mind had been exploited through the whole charade. Like a tool, he was used up completely and then discarded by both his girlfriend and her father. Just 7 months into working there, Elliot received his cancer diagnosis. Though its origins remained unclear, shortly after, his girlfriend left him and her father erased his existence. All of Elliot's life savings went towards desperately trying to battle the cancer and cling to life. That fight now seemed profoundly foolish. He should have surrendered from the beginning. Gritting his teeth, Elliot resentfully replayed it all. Why had he been cursed with such misfortune? Why couldn't the world be a better place? As Elliot felt the remaining vigor drain from his veins, he forced himself to release that bitter hatred. At least he didn't want to die and become a lingering, wandering spirit. If I die now, I wish I could start over in a better world. He knew it was pure fantasy, impossible in reality. But as death approached, such thoughts preoccupied his mind. Ever since starting chemotherapy, Elliot had developed an affinity for novels and comics about characters who died and awakened reincarnated in other worlds. Why not indulge in a bit of fairy tale fancy? He was a dying man after all, cut him some slack. Elliot smiled slightly, losing himself in fanciful daydreams of life beyond this one. Baseless and fleeting, such musings would scatter like dust when death's candle blew out his flame. Yet for now, imagining another chance is what kept the faint smile upon his face. The machine's beeping slowed. Nurses rushed in as doctors desperately tried saving him. 120 charge. Beep. 150 charge. Beep. Their efforts faded into background noise as Elliot's smile darkened into lifelessness. His glazing eyes grew unfocused and motionless as the agonized chaos unfolded around his corpse. With a last failed jolt of electricity, the doctor conceded defeat, dropping the defibrillators. Time of death, 3:04 p.m. Peace at last, or so Elliot assumed. But where was this place? He couldn't feel a body. No hands, legs or form, just an orb-like essence. Strange glowing orbs traversed a vast expanse of white roads leading towards different portals. Curious, he wondered, what are those things? Those, my friend, are souls, a masculine voice replied unexpectedly. Elliot tried glancing upwards but could only see about 90 degrees around. Then, without willing it, his orb lifted up towards the source of the voice. What met his gaze was someone, or something, too perfect to be mortal. Flowing silver locks framed striking yet sage features with flawless symmetry. Garbed in ornate floral fabrics, everything about this being oozed cunning intellect and absolute authority. He had a divine, terrible beauty. Hello, odd one, he murmured while closely scrutinizing the soul in his palm. Never have I encountered a soul so curious about other souls. He twirled his fingers, blue sparks dancing. Then his eyes shot wide. Oh my! His mouth fell open in astonishment. An ear-to-ear grin stretched across his face. In 3,000 years, never did I expect to discover such a rare treasure. He shouted joyously, giddily tossing the soul up and catching it. Thoroughly perplexed, Elliot wished the exuberant stranger would explain what was happening instead of throwing him around like a ball. But before Elliot could question anything, the being conjured a portal with one swirl of his finger. I'm sending you somewhere exciting. But given the urgency, explanations will have to wait. I promise aid and answers soon. Laughing, he hurtled Elliot's soul towards the shimmering portal. But in the final moments, an external force knocked his trajectory off course, sending him tumbling down endless glowing pathways. The man whipped around furiously. How dare you? He spat. You'd be stupid to think I'd let you get your way, trickster, a wispy female voice retorted. An ancient, diminutive woman leaned on a cane, seemingly appearing from thin air. Meddlesome hag, the man hissed. What could you possibly know? She shrugged indifferently. I know nothing. But that soul's not going back to you. Cackling, her entire presence exuded a mischievous, cunning witch. The man glared at the sea of souls, then smirked coldly. Foolish old crone. Have you forgotten that I am the god of deceit? No matter where he lands, I will find him. With that foreboding declaration, the man disappeared. The woman's triumphant expression chilled into unease. Meanwhile, Elliot's soul continued falling further down the glittering cosmic maze. After a few more aimless tumbles, he landed on an empty, isolated path. Gazing around, Elliot saw no other souls. He couldn't fly or climb back up the brilliant white web. But directly ahead lay an open portal. Ominous yet enticing, it offered the soul way forward. Against his better judgment, Elliot entered the ominous gate. His vision faded into darkness. Muddled sounds filtered through, chaotic chatter and a woman's pained screams. Push. Push, my lady. Push. It felt arduous, oppressive. Then Elliot felt himself dragged out by a strong force both inside and outside. With cold dread, he suddenly understood. Oh crap. Chapter 113 Getting Answers, Part 1. Northern gazed down upon the main hall, eyes brimming with dread. His fears carried horrific premonitions cascading through his mind as he observed each individual below. The girl and her companion who had briefly met his stare now turned a corner, disappearing down another hallway. This vast edifice undoubtedly harbored a labyrinth of passages. Northboy, you're finally awake. His eyes widened as a gruff voice called out from behind. Whirling to face the owner, he found himself swiftly enveloped in a tight embrace. Annette wrapped her arms around him, eyes closed in a delighted smile. In contrast, Northern's features strained into a troubled frown. He considered pulling away, but her grip proved surprisingly secure. Not that exerting genuine effort would fail to dislodge her, but still. Wrinkling his nose, he endured the impromptu reunion as Annette seemed to relish the moment. Then a low whisper escaped his lips. You reek. Annette's eyes flew open as she shoved him back harshly. Huh, that's how you address someone worried sick over you. Northern glanced around briefly before refocusing on her with an icy stare. Don't they have baths in this place? Annette's brows rose and twitched with indignation. Forget worrying over him. I'll break this brat. She was already quite accustomed to Northern's brusque demeanor, so it didn't really surprise her. He's the only one that could talk to her around here and get away with it. He did outsmart her once with that damned ability of his. I'm being so easy on him. Is it because I evaluated him? He's the only kid I kind of like around here. Or maybe she afforded him excessive leeway out of pity, suspecting him to be an unwitting pawn in Ruffsburg's schemes. She could have also taken a liking to him after seeing his father once at the Citadel. After all, Shin's dashing looks made him quite the heartthrob among female drifters in his youth. The number of scandalous dalliances before finally settling with Isha would surprise many. A deep frown etched Northern's features, commanding Annette's attention once more. With a resigned sigh, she addressed him with arms akimbo. I've been so worried about you. I have searched everywhere for you. To think you've been inside a rift all this while. His gaze lingered briefly toward the makeshift shelters before refocusing on her, suspicion tinging his tone. Where is this place? Did something happen? Who are all these people? Annette stared blankly for a few heartbeats as realization dawned. He doesn't know. Of course not. He's been in a rift all the while. Will you answer me or just keep gawking? Northern grunted impatiently. You need to fix that appalling disrespect. Then and even now, you speak like I am your mate. Annette chided. Northern arched a brow, belatedly acknowledging the truth of her words. Crap, I must automatically view her as an equal. Sometimes he slipped, instinctively reverting to his Elliot persona and forgetting his current circumstances. With the endless gauntlet in the rift, he could scarcely recall ever being Elliot at all. Given the relentless trials each day, What use was there in dwelling on his former life as a 20-something-year-old successful engineer? Even now, a part of him wished to discard that notion entirely and start fresh, experiencing a true childhood like his peers. But straying down that path served no purpose here, not when dread whispered that something catastrophic had transpired, demanding immediate answers. I'm sorry, that was out of line. I'm just agitated, he amended gruffly. Annette had scant familiarity with the real Northern, but this thoughtful apology seemed incongruous with the smug, overconfident brat she once met. She could only attribute the shift to one factor. He must have had his fair share hardship. A wistful smile graced her lips. Hardships possessed an unparalleled ability to humble even the most inflated egos, often without the victim's awareness. In her eyes, Northern had evolved from a petulant brat into a more pensive, if still occasionally brusque, individual. A transformation only achievable through being repeatedly forced to confront life and death trials. Or perhaps she was merely projecting her own assumptions onto his actions. But I still need to know, what's happening here? He remained resolute as the frown slowly resurfaced. His newly tempered demeanor didn't preclude blunt insistence when warranted. Allow me to explain, a baritone voice interjected. Northern turned, eyes widening at the sight of the approaching figure. What's going on here? Headmaster Gilbert. The wizened man offered a wistful smile. I imagine you're quite curious as to where we are and why we are here. Shall we discuss this privately? His gaze shifted toward the vermilion-haired woman. She scowled in response. A contemplative silence fell as Northern scrutinized the palpable tension between them before fixing Gilbert with a determined look. All right then. They had better have a damn reasonable explanation for why this place looks like the aftermath of obliteration. Gilbert turned to depart, but Northern paused, glancing back at Annette. Aren't you coming? She shrugged dismissively. That old dog would not want me there. Northern arched a reproachful brow. For someone who just chastised me about disrespect, you're far worse. Annette recoiled as if physically struck. This brat, hardship or not, he hasn't changed a bit. Refocusing on Gilbert, Northern stated bluntly, is it all right if Instructor Annette joins us? Though phrased as a question, his severe expression allowed no protest. Gilbert waved them forward before disappearing through the hallway, back where Northern had emerged from earlier. After a brief trek past the room he woke up in, they reached the corridor's end, a set of ornate double doors. Gilbert pushed them open, ushering them into a modest receiving room. Annette immediately claimed a sofa, crossing her legs as Northern positioned himself before her. Gilbert leaned against the table opposite, exhaling deeply. So, Northern's gravelly prompt shattered the taut silence. Currently, Gilbert began slowly. We are not in the Central Plains. We've been transported to the Dark Continent, Stellia, the Starlock continent in common language. Thud. Northern's composure shattered instantly, his expression contorting into a dark, murderous scowl that seemed to bore straight through Gilbert's soul. The elder's eyes flew wide as an icy chill gripped him. Bloodlust. Tendrils of primal fear crept up his spine. Before he could so much as draw his blade, Northern had already closed the distance, a black dagger now pressing precariously against Gilbert's jugular, drawing a bead of crimson. Were you in on it too? What useless crap is you and the principal planning to do? Northern inquired with the cold ferocious glare of an experienced killer. Chapter 114 Getting Answers, Part 2. Annette's jaw dropped, her eyes wide with disbelief. What? As a master, she had graduated from being a regular drifter. The true journey of realizing a drifter's power and might began when they entered the vagrant rank and became masters. Their soul essence became much more potent, enabling abilities like spiritual release. A vast repertoire of new abilities opened before them. Not just that, but their senses of perception and physical capabilities heightened incredibly. They could hear 10 times better than a regular drifter, their bodies restructured and imbued with extraordinary strength. Their talents took unique roots, setting them apart from the rest. This made masters exceptionally formidable opponents. In other words, they were the beginning of what it truly meant to be a drifter. There was no way a regular drifter's movements should have escaped Annette's keen eyes. Distracted or not, it was simply not possible. A bead of sweat trickled down her flushed face as she froze mid-motion, almost standing up. All she felt was a gust of wind. She hadn't even seen the boy move at all. How? This makes absolutely no sense. Northern's speed was terrifying, defying any reasonable explanation. She would have assumed he possessed a speed-based talent if she hadn't witnessed his cloning ability firsthand herself. Come to think of it, he was also fast that day, but not enough for me to worry. Back then, Annette had merely considered Northern physically impressive for his age. Still, this view is so nice. A sly smile curled her lips as she settled back into the plush sofa. Northern shot Gilbert a sidelong glance, pressing the black stiletto against his throat before he could move. Answer me. Northern shouted furiously, the wind whipping violently around them, carrying his anger. Gilbert met the boy's gaze with indifference, though cautious. He's strong, powered by rage and fury. It's understandable how he surprised me like that. He could easily turn the situation around, but that would be unfair to this enraged young man. With a sigh, he spoke, "Young one. I don't understand. Don't you dare deny it." Northern interrupted, increasing the pressure of the blade, a trickle of blood snaking down Gilbert's throat. "You think I'm stupid? On the evaluation day, the way Ruffsberg looked at me, I could tell that crappy bastard had something up his sleeve. And the teleportation spell art in the hall where we waited was the same as the one he used to bring me to you on that flying ship." Gilbert's eyes widened, giving him away. Narrowing his eyes to icy azure slits, Northern pressed on, "Judging by your reaction, I'm right. After Ruffsberg left your place, you abandoned the Citadel and came to the Academy. I don't know why I found myself in some rift, but I can guess why you're here with the other students." He lifted his chin defiantly as Northern continued, "You're using us, aren't you? I don't know what you guys are up to, but I'm sure you're using us against our parents' consent." Gilbert held Northern's fiery gaze for a few tense seconds before exhaling slowly. Northern instantly leapt back, soaring over 5 meters in a single reflexive jump to land where he'd started. Even Annette couldn't help but be amazed. His jump is massive. To anyone else, it might have seemed ordinary, but Annette or any master would have recognized that Northern had reacted instinctively to Gilbert's spiritual release. It wasn't even an intentional jump. His legs were like coiled springs. If I had not moved away, I would have lost my hand. Northern eyed the hand clutching the stiletto. It wasn't a bluff like instructor Annette's earlier. It would have really severed my hand. The realization struck him. I may have grown stronger, but these bastards are powerful in their own ways. With their different talents, they'll be incredibly hard to kill. He cut off that train of thought abruptly. Am I actually considering how to kill a bunch of humans? He was so accustomed to killing for self-preservation that the thought came naturally, even when no one posed an immediate threat. At least not yet. Dismissing his dagger, he exhaled softly through pursed lips. Gilbert's voice rang out, "While you're correct about certain things, you're also mistaken about others. I'm not obligated to inform you of anything except what pertains to our survival on this treacherous continent." He wiped the blood from his neck with a black handkerchief, dropping it onto the table. "Now, will you allow me to bring you up to date on the current situation and how we can return home?" Annette frowned at his words but stayed silent. Speaking to the old man previously had proved futile. Right now, she just wanted to escape this place and cut all ties. To her, Gilbert had gone from an iconic figure she admired to a senseless lapdog over the past few months. Of course, she didn't know the depth of his connection to Ruffsberg, nor did she care. The Gilbert she thought she knew was a man who stood up for the weak, no matter the opposition. Now, she wasn't even sure what she knew anymore. "I would still like to know though." Northern's casual tone was at odds with the lingering aura of danger around his deceptively relaxed demeanor. "Were you all sent to a rift like me?" Gilbert studied him for a few moments, finding the sudden mood shift strange, before responding. "No. Of all of us, you were the only one." Northern smiled, though there was nothing warm about the expression. "All right. Now you can brief me on the current situation and how we can go back home." Gilbert frowned. That smile is deeply disturbing. I can't read him at all. Even Annette eyed him with surprise. She could tell he was up to something, though she couldn't discern what. And again, she couldn't get over the level of composure he maintained. While seated behind him, she had considered every possible attack pattern, but Northern remained so composed that they all proved futile in her mind. He had no openings. She couldn't help but wonder, what in the world happened to you in that rift? Chapter 115. Northern is a sly fox. Northern paid rapt attention as Gilbert began speaking. 7 months ago, we all came to Stelia. I'm guessing that was around the same time you entered the rift you just closed down. Gilbert looked directly at Northern as he continued. This place where we're currently stationed is known as the Lodaliwan Kingdom. It had previously been lost to a horde of monsters. When we arrived, we needed somewhere to settle, but everywhere was swarming with those beasts. So I took the initiative and led the students here. Together, we were able to slay the monsters and reclaim this portion of the kingdom, including the castle. He paused briefly. Much later, we began receiving refugees, natives of Lothalewin and neighboring clans who had lost their homes to the monsters' onslaught. They filled us in on the state of affairs and how the rifts came to be. Gilbert's voice trailed off as he explained the rifts, emergence to Northern, the grave threat they posed, and the fact that they were growing in tier. However, he omitted great details such as the existence of other student groups who had arrived earlier and formed strongholds elsewhere. Many had perished, but the survivors were now loyal mercenaries to the only country that had withstood the disaster. He even neglected to mention that one country had endured the disaster. Not that he wanted or needed to divulge everything to Northern. In fact, telling him this much already made Gilbert feel as though he was treating the young man like some special guest, a notion he despised. It caused him to be more guarded, withholding other key information. Finally, he told Northern about how their stronghold operated. We have 10 parties, each comprising 2 teams of 4 drifters. The 10 parties are led by the strongest drifters, handpicked by me personally. Their mission is to hunt monsters, which serve as a food source, while the soul cores are used to trade with other strongholds for vital items and amenities needed for daily survival. He looked squarely at Northern. My plan is to close down all rifts and return home victorious. To make Mama proud, Northern interjected brutally, his expression one of disdain. Arching a bushy brow, the burly man scrutinized Northern with a scowl. I'm not sure what you mean. Northern folded his arms across his chest. I don't understand why you're aiming to close all the rifts before finding a way back home. Who exactly do you intend to impress? He glared at Gilbert, defiant. The priority right now should be getting us home. Don't you have families you want to see? Anger tinged his voice. We have a chance to save these people. The rifts are conquerable, Gilbert insisted. Northern let out an inhuman, perverse laugh before pinning the headmaster with an icy stare. Have you ever actually been inside one? Gilbert frowned. No. Unfolding his arms, Northern scoffed, and you call it easy? He chuckled darkly. If it was so simple, why were these people plagued by the rifts for 30 years, or was it 20? A deafening silence fell over the room. At that point, Annette allowed herself a small, proud smile for Northern, even though she had no right to feel that way. His fearless demeanor as he addressed Gilbert as an equal was deeply impressive. Gilbert hesitated before answering. We were always going to venture into those rifts eventually. They're only tier 3, the one that posed real danger, you already closed down. So how bad could they be? Northern's eyes widened fractionally as the headmaster's words registered. How bad could it be? He echoed Gilbert's nonchalant query, then chuckled darkly as memories of his harrowing rift experience flashed through his mind. He inhaled and exhaled slowly before pinning Gilbert with a level stare. You have no idea, headmaster. No idea at all of how bad it can really be. Gilbert gestured placatingly, his expression warmly persuasive. And that's precisely where you come in. You survived in that rift for 6 months. With the invaluable information you can provide, this endeavor will be far easier. Northern shook his head slowly, brows furrowed, lips turned down in a morose frown. After a heartbeat of tense silence, he spoke in a toneless rasp. As you said, you have no obligation to tell me anything except what pertains to getting our survival. And undoubtedly, you decide what qualifies as useful for that purpose. He met Gilbert's gaze unflinchingly. Likewise, I have no obligation to provide you any information unless it directly relates to returning home. Gilbert's frown deepened into a ferocious scowl. Nonsense. His powerful voice lanced through the room. What are you saying? That you'll withhold critical information? With what you know, we could close all the rifts and go home. We can return home without needing to close those rifts. And even after closing them, what's your plan for getting us home? I don't think you've even considered that. Your scheme is suicidal, and I can hardly blame you, headmaster. You haven't witnessed the horrors inside those rifts. If you had, you wouldn't be entertaining such reckless ideas. A cocky grin split Gilbert's face as he seemed to slowly unravel. If a talentless whelp like you could clear it, what's to stop the rest of us, those with actual talents and superior foundations, from succeeding? Northern smiled sweetly. I'm going to pretend you didn't just call me talentless. You seem to think you can pull it off because I did. But I'm nothing but a cowardly, selfish stone who would do whatever it takes to survive, even lick a monster's ass. I see you as a hero of justice, always judging what's good and bad. You're just soft bread. You wouldn't last a month in that hellhole. Gilbert frowned deeply. His temperament is astounding. I intentionally tried to provoke him, but he didn't flinch. Besides, I have no plans to withhold information from you. I'll share what I know. Whatever you choose to do with it is not my concern. Gilbert raised an inquisitive brow at Northern. But it would be extremely foolish of me to give away the only valuable asset I possess for free, wouldn't it? A sly grin tugged at the young man's lips. Chapter 116 Raven Light Kageyama, Part 1. After Northern's discussion with Headmaster Gilbert, a few things were established. The most important one, however, was that he was able to maintain his independence. Northern managed to negotiate his way out of being directly associated with them or joining any parties while still securing certain benefits. Of course, Gilbert was an experienced drifter, a sage at that. He wasn't the kind of man Northern could simply manipulate to his own ends. In fact, Northern even suspected that Gilbert had accepted some of his terms because the old man had his own cunning plans afoot. The thought made him incredibly uneasy. I need to be very wary of him going forward. He's a runaway train headed for a wreck. Northern believed Gilbert's heroic ideals were utterly nonsensical. He didn't understand why anyone would want to play the selfless savior amid this disaster when they could simply focus on finding a way back home. Stupid. He is incredibly stupid. I can't entirely blame him though. He has never even faced the night terror. Northern suddenly halted mid-stride as an idea sparked in his mind. He curled one corner of his lips into a devious smirk, concocting a cunning plan. That grin of yours is giving me the creeps, Annette remarked. He glanced at her, nearly forgetting the master was walking beside him. You're still here. Yes, I'm still here. Why do you have to say it like that? She grunted. Northern tilted his head, confused for a moment. Sorry I guess. Annette stared at him silently for a few beats before letting out a whirl of laughter that filled the dark hallway with echoing peals. Her abrupt mirth only compounded Northern's bewilderment. She looked at him with those vibrant, flaming eyes. So you are like that, huh? Socially awkward, yet you displayed such impressive composure before a sage. Northern offered a shy smile. Honestly, I wasn't sure if it would work. I just had to try, regardless. A frown creased his pale brows. That man, he's a sinking ship. His crazy ideals will destroy everyone around him. Annette studied him blankly for a moment. I guess you must have seen your own fair share of hell. His frown deepened into a malevolent glare. That was far more than a mere fair share, Instructor Anne. He strode forward determinedly. Dazed for a few seconds, Annette watched him go before hastening to catch up. Still, if you're talking about the one with crazy ideals, I don't think Gilbert should be your primary concern. What do you mean? He asked without turning his head. As they emerged from the hallway, a flowery scent washed over Northern, making him stop abruptly. I recognize this smell. He glanced left and right urgently. What's wrong? Annette queried, seeing his sudden halt. At that moment, two feminine figures ascended the stairs to the platform from the right side. Annette smiled wickedly. Speak of the devil, she muttered under her breath. Raven and Terence came to a stop before Northern, the air instantly chilling with awkward tension for several heartbeats. Northern studied her intently, gauging her abilities, while she too seemed to be doing the same to him. Shit. If we leave these two be, they could spend hours just staring at each other. Raven is the worst match for socially awkward Northern, Annette deliberated. And it seemed she wasn't the only one concerned about the situation. Her gaze met Terence's, and the two temporary comrades nodded in silent accord. Terence clapped lightly and cutely cocked her head. Oh, this must be the new drifter from the rift. Care to introduce yourself, Light? Raven nodded curtly. Hi. Terence froze, her attempt at lightening the mood having backfired spectacularly. Hello. Northern responded simply. Raven squinted at him, then stated bluntly, you're strong. And you don't have a soul core or soul essence. I get that often, I guess. Northern curled one corner of his lips, trying to hide his rising terror. She could discern that much just from looking at me. He could only perceive Raven as incredibly powerful due to his eyes, all eyes. Perhaps using the unseeing eyes would reveal more, but that could draw unwanted attention with his eyes glowing brighter than usual. For now, he wanted to keep as low a profile as possible in this place. Not to hide his strength necessarily, but not to overtly show it either. That way, people would let their guards down around him, allowing him to take his precious time identifying new talents to copy. Northern, this is Raven. She's probably the strongest drifter among your peers, Annette's throaty voice shattered the heavy silence. Raven shot her an indifferent, unimpressed look before turning back to Northern. I don't consider myself the strongest. There are probably many who could defeat me if they used their abilities properly and their senses keenly. Like Adrian, for instance. Hey Light, let's not do that here, Terrence quickly interrupted with a nervous laugh. I'm sorry, she's something of a talent ability geek. She bowed slightly and steered Raven toward the hallway. Almost reaching it, Raven paused and glanced back, her silvery voice lilting, "What's your name?" Northern also turned slightly, that floral scent seemed to intensify at that moment. My name is Northern. A frown creased her delicate brows. What a strange name. Don't you have another? Well, my mother often calls me Lael. It's supposed to be some native name she gave me. So, all right then, I'll call you Lael. Northern arched a brow. I was about to say she secretly calls me that. Still, it felt strangely nice to hear. What party do you plan to join, Lael? He lifted his chin slightly, brimming with confidence. I don't plan on joining any. Disappointment flickered across Raven's features as she glanced down briefly before meeting his gaze again. Very well then. We'll meet again, Lael. With that, she turned and vanished into the dark hallway, Terrence in tow. Northern stared after her departing form for a few moments. What a strange girl, he muttered under his breath. Chapter 117 Raven Light Kageyama, Part 2. Raven gently rapped her knuckles against the wooden door before pushing it open. Inside, she found Gilbert hunched over his table, arms folded, a dark cloud of worry etched onto his wizened features. Sage Gilbert, is everything all right? Terrence's voice rang with sincere concern as she peered over Raven's shoulder from the hallway. Gilbert's brow furrowed into a deep frown. He's a difficult one, he grumbled, leaning back in his chair to regard the two ladies. What happened? Terrence pressed, stepping fully into the room with Raven. Turning his gaze to Raven, Gilbert explained, he refused to give us the information for free, and he thinks your idea to close down all the rifts instead of focusing on going home is a suicidal attempt. Raven's expression remained indifferent, her crimson eyes unflinching. I see, she said coldly after a beat of silence. Anyone would think that. Terrence spoke with uttermost worry, her gaze shifting between Gilbert and Raven. Even the Empire isn't paying attention to all the rifts anymore. They've come to understand these rifts cannot be defeated. Many have ventured into them, never to return. Yet you still insist on closing them. Raven gave her a curt nod of affirmation. Terrence stared at the unbreakable young woman, her pale face a mask of exasperation. This girl would surely be the death of her with these constant headaches. Common sense didn't seem to work on Raven Light Kageyama. Drawing a deep breath, Terrence asked sternly, Light, who gave you this wild idea that you can clear the rifts? For a few heartbeats, Raven was silent, her gaze drifting towards the closed door, she seemed to be looking beyond it. Finally, she responded, it was merely speculation before. But now that he made it out, I'm even more confident. With a loud exhale, Terrence palmed half of her face, shaking her head. There's no talking you out of this, is there? Her voice took on a pleading tone as she continued, we could just focus on going to your continent, you know. The people here would gladly follow you there. But Raven was unmoved, shaking her head firmly. They'll never be accepted. They'll be trampled upon and treated as outsiders because that's what they are. They need to fight for their true home. Her words rang with iron resolve and a wisdom beyond her years that even Terrence could not deny. The whole insane plan to conquer and close every last rift had been Raven's idea. She was the one who planted those seeds in Gilbert's mind. Terrence wasn't privy to the exact words used to sway the sage, but clearly Raven had coaxed him enough to see some benefit in her scheme. In other words, it was possible Gilbert supported her so fervently because he had something to gain. But for Raven, she just genuinely wanted to help these displaced people find a true home again. At first, Terrence had doubted the girl's intentions, certain there had to be some selfish or hypocritical side hiding beneath that pure exterior. That was why she had initially kept Raven so close, to unveil whatever flaws lurked beneath the surface, to understand why this stranger suddenly wanted to aid a group she had no ties to. As days stretched into weeks and months, however, Terrence found only deeper admiration for the young warrior. Raven had led the siege to claim this very castle from the monsters. She had gathered parties to scour the lands for survivors, bringing them back to the relative safety of the fortress. She had hunted monster after monster to feed the people. She had journeyed to negotiate with the western stronghold of Sloria, establishing a vital trade agreement though they still refused refugees. It was Raven who selected each party leader, explaining their capabilities and potential to Gilbert. She had filtered out the weak-willed from the strong with an almost preternatural sense, advising Sage Gilbert to groom the latter to lead. All of this behind closed doors, in private councils with the elderly sage himself. For the longest time, Terence had assumed all these sweeping reforms were Gilbert's ideas, unaware of the real force driving it all from the shadows. When she found out, she at first had taken Raven for the deranged type, a manipulator who loved ruling from the shadows, because how else did she have the elderly sage wrapped around her finger? Much later, Terence realized that couldn't be further from the truth. Raven would have stepped up as the overt leader if needed be. But the survivors and students were different factions in need of a firm, resonant voice to unite them, one only an experienced and strong elder like Gilbert could provide. Even though Raven was confident in her strength over all others here, she had chosen the most effective path, putting the people's survival and growth over any desires for personal dominion. Or perhaps there were other reasons she avoided the spotlight, reasons Terence suspected but never prodded. She had come to adore Raven's pure intentions too much to risk sowing doubt. Never before had Terence encountered someone so selflessly driven to uplift others. Gilbert must have recognized that incredible spirit as well, which is why he entertaining even her most outlandish ideas. Wilde didn't begin to describe Raven's plans, and yet, they had come this far largely thanks to those schemes. If anyone could help them take back their homeland, it was this mysterious young woman. With a resigned sigh, Terence gave a reluctant nod. You're right, we need to fight for what's ours. I don't think any amount of persuasion will stop you from doing what you intend. So what's the plan? Raven nodded curtly in return, crimson eyes fixing on Gilbert intently. When is he going to give us the information? He asked for a few days to rest and assess things, the elderly sage replied. And what price did he ask in return? Gilbert scoffed derisively. An equal share of any updated way home, a place to stay secluded from the crowd where he won't be bothered, even if it's monster infested. HMPH, I personally think he's going to die soon. The fool is overconfident, ignorant of the true dangers even run-of-the-mill monsters pose out there. He hasn't even encountered a catastrophe-level corpse eater. Raven's expression turned severe, a silent rebuke in her crimson stare. I strongly advise you do not underestimate him. Falling silent, Gilbert met her intense gaze, giving the warning due consideration. That being said, Raven continued after a moment, I plan to go on a journey, and I want him to come with me. Who? The new boy. Gilbert's eyebrows shot up. Raven nodded, her lustrous black hair swaying gently with the motion. I don't think he'll want to follow you at all, the elderly sage doubted with a shake of his head. A small, enigmatic smile played across Raven's full lips. Don't worry, I think he will, if I offer him the right price. Chapter 118 Singularity Dark Terror. Northern relaxed into the worn couch in Annette's quarters, her bed sitting opposite but currently unoccupied. She had welcomed him to stay for a few hours while she went to arrange lodging per Gilbert's instructions. Her place is set apart from the rest. Unlike the pseudo-civilization teeming with survivors, Annette's abode stood in blessed seclusion. Still, it remained close enough to avoid monster onslaughts, though even at this location, Northern doubted she could ever truly avoid such threats entirely. But then, Instructor Anne is quite strong, and she's probably only grown. She may be the strongest here besides Gilbert. I wonder if the twins are around as well. For several leisurely minutes, Northern simply lounged on the couch, mind idly wandering. But then he remembered a task at hand. Closing his eyes, he opened them once more to the grandeur of the limitless void's throne hall. He found himself standing before the sinister flames dancing their eerie ballet, shrouding the enormous throne in a tenebrous aura of dread authority. Northern paused, staring into the hypnotic undulations for a few heartbeats. Then, averting his gaze, he turned to the side. Adding a solemn depth to his tone, he called out. Dark terror. A thick flame as black as the night itself erupted before him, flickering with dancing azure hues. As it slowly receded, the stalwart form of a monster took shape from the fiery depths. Red tetrad eyes burned with graceless ferality, the terror's maw slightly ajar to reveal terrifying rows of jagged fangs. It stood even taller than before, forcing Northern to crane his neck upwards into that scorching glare. Black lustrous horns twisted from its head, while an extra pair of arms had emerged beneath the originals, both pairs coiled like wire cables beneath the monster's onyx skin. Its sinuous tail slithered out from behind, gently swaying. As fearsome as ever, Northern murmured, folding his arms as he appraised the terror's evolution with an approving nod. His gaze lingered on those new secondary limbs. These must be from after its evolution. If he recalled correctly, he had managed to slay Night Terror just as that metamorphosis was completing. That was unnatural luck, he said softly, pursing his lips. I don't know where I'd be now if I hadn't unlocked the unseeing eyes. Gently, he reached out to lay a hand on the terror's bulging, furred chest. Its skin held a sinister, stinging chill that prickled gooseflesh up his arm. Let's make sure we don't ever get that close to dying again, Northern vowed. With a sigh, he called out again. Call. The same powerful flames erupted in an even grander blaze. Call, after all, was an entity far mightier than Night Terror ever was. But I'd prefer Night Terror, Northern mused, if this ability allows me to utilize its powers. I wonder if it will be possible to use the abilities of the vestige of chaos itself. If so, that would be incredibly useful, because I have a plan in mind. His eyes settled on the energetic plumes of flames, slowly resolving into the humanoid form of Call itself. Skin of burnished darkness, sinister red engravings snaking across its entire body. A single pair baleful eyes filled with primal malice. A devilish horn, longer and more twisted than even Night Terror's, jutting from its head. A cloak of pure umbral gloom shrouding its figure. The sight stirred memories of Northern's harrowing battle against the Castle Lord, of how Night Terror had swooped in to steal that final kill at the last moment. A contented smile tugged at his lips. It all happened for the best, I suppose. Who knows what might have occurred had I taken those fragments for myself. Turning his attention back to Night Terror's motionless form, Northern studied the description on his void abilities use, for a certain idea had been percolating in his mind. Description. You can choose to materialize the soul of any entity you have slain. Doing so bestows you with that soul's abilities. With a thought, he summoned his clone to his left, both of them shrouded in eternal twilight. Then he mentally commanded the clone to utilize the void ability. Immediately, Night Terror's stalwart shape was consumed in roiling black and azure flames that enveloped the clone as well, hungrily devouring its form over a long period. As the inferno finally died away, Northern beheld his clone, remade. A torrent of pure exhilaration surged through his veins. But the true exhilaration was yet to come. His eyes widened as a flood of notification panels burst into view. Congratulations. You have recorded an incredible feat. You have successfully created a singularity, Dark Terror. The singularity will be extracted from your cloning talent. This will cause your cloning ability to revert to its original rank. However, the singularity is now an independent entity, sharing a mental link with you alone. On your command, it is capable of independent actions, with the same capacity for growth as your original clones. In other words, this singularity Dark Terror can continue evolving, and upon each evolution you will be ingrained with all of its strength. When this singularity slays other monsters, it can absorb their soul essence, allowing you to gain talent fragments. The owned talent singularity S class has been reverted to advancing cloning A class. You can use talent fragments to further evolve this talent. Northern's jaw went slack as another explanation panel materialized. By having your singularity clone utilize the void ability, you did not simply materialize Dark Terror, you permanently separated that one clone's existence into an independent singularity. Crap. He breathed out in awe. He had certainly not expected such a magnified, paradigm-shifting result. His original thought had been that instead of manifesting Night Terror directly onto himself, having a clone do so would prove more effective. That way he could diversify his power, especially if the clone could also wield the vestige of chaos abilities. But to think his clone would permanently become Dark Terror itself by achieving true singularity. Does that mean the sole purpose of the singularity was always meant to separate the one clone, to elevate it into its own entity? It would certainly explain the ability's name, me, myself and I, as well as the description. I am the only one, it is me, myself and I. All others strengthen me. Now that I think about it, it does sound exactly like something meant to develop a sense of true, individual self. Northern studied the motionless terror, not a shred of outward emotion or awareness on its hideous features. Then his gaze turned to the flickering form of Call. So if I rank up the talent further, I might be able to create a singularity Call as well. The prospect was almost too tantalizing to behold. With a slight pang of regret, he dismissed Call back into the void's embrace, leaving only Dark Terror's presence behind. Grinning widely, he spoke to the terror. You and I are going to accomplish great things together. Chapter 119 Northern, PFFT. Northern opened his eyes, emerging from the plane of the limitless void. A remnant of blissful joy still lingered on his face as Annette opened the door and walked in. Huh, were you dozing off? She asked, arching an inquisitive brow. Northern rose to his feet, shaking his head slightly. Though he longed to revel in the wondrous experience, he swiftly composed himself. Not at all, he retorted, his expression turning impassive as his azure eyes swept over Annette's humble abode. The living space bore a rugged, roughly hewn charm. A simple carved table and chair stood beside her bed, antique brown papers resembling dried animal hides resting atop the surface. Overhead, the makeshift ceiling was fashioned from the skins of slain monsters. The rain here can be brutal at times. It broke through once, so I had to improvise, Annette explained, noting Northern's lingering gaze upon the unimpressive ceiling. She scratched her head sheepishly. Why am I even justifying myself? Don't you often get attacked by monsters at night? Northern interjected, his solemn eyes meeting hers. Over 100 kilometers from here, that area seems infested with them. Being this far from the main settlement must make you a frequent target. Annette's brow furrowed momentarily before her lips curled into an amused smirk. Are you worried about me? No. I'm merely asking, he stated flatly. I want to understand why you've chosen to reside so far away. Wait a minute. How is he able to tell the distance? Has he been there before? She studied him for a few beats, then shrugged nonchalantly. Seriously, this guy, I'm so lost. Well, I was staying there until 3 months ago. A lot of things started pissing me off, let's leave it at that. And yes, I get attacked frequently. Thanks to that, I might become a savant sooner than expected. Northern's eyes widened slightly. Oh, that's fortunate. Indeed. Annette nodded, a glint of pride in her vermilion eyes. When you reach the master rank, it's as if you hit an invisible wall. Advancing to the next level becomes exponentially harder, haunted by the thought of when your soul core will finally be satiated. Generally, it takes years of relentless hunting to progress, but I've managed it in mere months. She paused, a sly grin tugging at her lips. Do you know why? Because of the sheer number of monsters you encounter here, Northern deduced. Precisely. And their ranks too, the weakest around here are of the savage rank. There's even an apex-level savage lurking towards the northern part of the capital. Annette trailed off abruptly, biting her lip to stifle the laughter threatening to erupt. Don't. Northern warned, his tone flat. Just continue. But Annette could no longer contain her mirth, dissolving into raucous laughter as she stumbled backward. The northern part of the capital. Northern, I mean, the northern part. She guffawed loudly, clutching her sides as tears of amusement pricked her eyes. Northern watched in awkward silence, painfully accustomed to such mockery over his name, a cruel twist of fate courtesy of his whimsical father, Shin. He could vividly recall the day they discovered him, when Shin decided to name the newfound child after the forest that had blessed them with a son. Though it deeply embarrassed his mother, she hadn't the heart to defy her husband's wishes. Ultimately, she bestowed upon Northern a secret name originating from her tribe. As Annette's laughter finally subsided, her dancing eyes met Northern's frosty glare. Ahem. She cleared her throat, endeavoring to recompose herself. Forgive me, I've been looking forward to that ever since learning your unfortunate name. I presume the headmaster gave it to you. Northern extended his hand expectantly. Of course. Producing a folded, antiqued brown paper akin to those on her table, Annette's lips twitched with the effort of suppressing another grin. But I'm concerned, the location he provided points to the northern side, the very area we discussed. Though she struggled valiantly, her expression still grated on Northern's nerves. He shrugged dismissively. It's fine. That's precisely where I wish to go. Annette studied him intently for a moment, then sighed in resignation. I can't fathom what's going through your mind. But do not grow overconfident. Her gaze intensified. You may have emerged from a Tier 5 rift, but the monsters here are not to be underestimated either. A small, confident smile played across Northern's lips as he nodded obediently. I'm not overconfident. I'm simply confident in my abilities. Annette's eyes widened briefly before she scoffed lightly. I see. Extending the paper, she continued, this is a map of the city. Dangerous areas are marked in red, your abode in black. Thank you, Northern murmured softly, accepting the map. Think nothing of it. Though I am curious. She eyed him speculatively. What will you be doing? Are you truly uninterested in joining any parties? He nodded, his expression stern. I have no interest in parties. After battling monsters for 6 months, I think I'd like a respite before venturing into anything of that nature. Anything I do will be aimed at returning to the Central Plains. A contemplative look settled over Annette's features. I see. She hesitated, then continued carefully, one final question, then. Northern met her gaze expectantly. Drawing a steadying breath, she asked, what happened in that rift? Why was it growing? How did you survive, alone? An enigmatic smile curved Northern's lips as he closed his eyes briefly, then reopened them. What's the hurry? You can always learn of those when I choose to reveal it generally. Annette held his inscrutable gaze for several heartbeats before scoffing lightly. Honestly, I can't make heads or tails of what's going on in that head of yours. And it's frustrating. She scratched her hidden scalp absently. Anyway, there's a massive wolf at the castle that won't let anyone near. It's fiercely guarding a satchel in its jaws. Northern arched a brow. Mr. Fluffy. For a few moments, Annette could only gape wordlessly. She had suspected the peculiar wolf's connection to Northern, yet simultaneously doubted such a fantastical notion. It was impossible for monsters to simply accompany drifters of their own accord unless tamed. And true tamers were incredibly rare. Hearing him casually refer to the beast by name utterly confirmed her suspicion, leaving her momentarily speechless. At this rate, I'm not even surprised anymore. He's probably not going to explain how the hell he managed to acquire a monster companion without being a tamer. She sighed heavily. I guess your father isn't the only one with issues regarding names. Northern's brow furrowed in confusion. Waving her hand dismissively, Annette refocused her vermilion eyes upon him. I have a hunt in a few minutes. Feel free to stay around for as long as you'd like. It would be nice to catch up when I return, but I doubt that will be possible. A wry smile tugged at her lips. Whatever you do, don't get reckless. Northern responded with a small, sincere smile. Thank you. You're welcome. Turning to depart, Annette paused as Northern's voice halted her steps. Instructor Anne. She glanced over her shoulder inquiringly. Yes, Northboy. Forgive me for asking, but how does one transfer items to another person? Let's say I want to sell items. How would I go about that? Her eyes widened in disbelief. This guy, you really survived that rift without knowing a damn thing. Chapter 120 The Horror of Brimfield Estate Part 1. Chapter 119. Items were quite the unusual phenomena in the world of drifters. When received, they became intrinsically bound to a drifter's soul, and it didn't matter how far apart they were from the drifter, they'd always return to their soul. This explained how Northern could still summon the mortal blade despite leaving it behind in his room before his capture by the wannabe night terrors. The blade had simply returned to the embrace of his soul as mere unwoven sparks, and even he could innately sense them lingering there. However, the concept of permanently transferring possession had always perplexed him. How could one relinquish an item forever when it continually returned to its original owner's soul? Who knew it would be so simple? As Annette had succinctly explained before departing, all he needed was to summon the desired item and directly pass it to the intended recipient while mentally willing the transfer. If the item disappeared upon contact, the transaction failed and required repeating. But if it remained, the exchange was successful, both parties instinctively aware of the soul-bound gain or loss. An inexplicable sensation drifters simply understood. Northern was immensely grateful for this insight, having wondered how to sell his surplus items. Not that he was in any hurry, but possessing such knowledge was invaluable. First, I need to settle in and assess the situation, he deliberated pragmatically. Gather information about this environment, what it was like before the monster disaster and the means they used for travel to other continents. Then his mental strategizing ground to an abrupt halt as he collided with someone, stumbling half a step back as reflex compelled him to murmur, I'm sorry. Watch where ya going, bro. A tiny, snarling voice snapped. Belatedly glancing down, Northern found himself eyeing a fierce yet emotionless black-haired child who couldn't have been 10 years old yet. Isn't that rude for someone so young? The boy shot him a wild glare. What ya looking at? Exhaling slowly, Northern pinched the bridge of his nose as a rigid cord formed on his brow. Apologies for not watching my path. Still, shouldn't a child like yourself be back at the castle gates with the others? It's rather dangerous out here. The child's scowl deepened. None a business, he yelled defiantly, brushing past Northern with an arrogant swagger. Northern watched the peculiar child's retreating form, an odd sense of familiarity nagging at him, as if he'd encountered this boy before, yet he was certain he hadn't. If so, the memorable arrogance would have left an indelible impression. Dismissing the enigmatic encounter, his thoughts suddenly pivoted. Mr. Fluffy. He'd completely forgotten about retrieving Mr. Fluffy after finishing with Annette. Well, I'll fetch him next time I visit the capital. Nodding to himself, he turned and continued down the narrow street, flanked by the remnants of stone residences, pubs, and inns, once lively structures now rendered hollow and desolate, struggling to recount happier days. After a few minutes, Northern reached a gated estate entrance, the iron portcullis overgrown with tangled vines yet left ajar. Through the opening, He glimpsed the overgrown path leading to the estate's lone mansion, the surrounding forest harboring an unmistakable aura. Damn, this place is packed with monsters. He had sensed their presence from some distance but deliberately avoided confrontation, not out of trepidation, but because he was keenly aware of being followed. Unsurprising, given his recent emergence from a Tier 5 rift after 6 harrowing months. They were undoubtedly curious about his capabilities. In fact, he suspected this was precisely why Gilbert had provided him with these coordinates, an unspoken test, of sorts. A sly smile curved Northern's lips as he surveyed his surroundings. They're quite skilled, too, light on their feet. As a walker, I likely would not have detected them. Evolving into a drifter had heightened his environmental awareness to an extraordinary degree. I wonder if it's like this for everyone, or if my unique eyes grant me some spatial awareness. The concept of spatial awareness, an innate, panoramic sense of one's surroundings without need for direct observation, was something he had attempted to evoke during the castle battle against the monster horde. He couldn't definitively confirm whether he had succeeded until he entered battle, but his instincts insisted it probably had manifested upon achieving the drifter rank. In any case, he would know when he battles a couple of monsters. But he didn't intend to do so anytime soon. Not when he was being followed. Let's make this a bit of fun. A menacing grin spread across his features. Then, without preamble, Northern vanished, leaving only a wake of fractured ground in his absence. Two observers, one camouflaged amongst the ebony slates 50 meters from the estate gate and another peering through an abandoned inn's window, reacted with stunned disbelief as their quarry seemed to blink out of existence. He didn't discover us, did he? The building-bound scout thought and flew through the broken window in a blur. His partner followed, running swiftly across the slates without making any sound. Then he flew into the air and landing on the inner roll, before standing up and running a few steps forward. Both of them converged at the point Northern had been. Tense frowns creased their features as they eyed each other warily. Do you think our cover was blown? The slate dweller asked, brow furrowed. His companion shook his head adamantly. Impossible. My stealth ability completely erases my presence. There's no way he could have sensed us. Then why do you think he moved like that, so suddenly? The frantic stare settled on the bony, scarred face of the inn lurker. Whatever horrors had befallen him, leaving a crude indentation trailing from beneath his eyes to his jawline, was cruel. It might have been spontaneous, the inn dweller surmised. We could be overthinking this. So what should we do? The slate dweller inquired, the tattered cloak framing his jaw fluttering gently in the breeze. A resolute gleam entered the inn dweller's eye. What else? We follow him. Without further discussion, both blurred into motion once more, determined to unravel the mystery of the drifter who had survived a Tier 5 rift. Chapter 121: The Horror of Brimfield Estate, Part 2. The path ahead was shrouded in impenetrable darkness, towering trees interweaving their massive branches like tentacles across the sky, enshrouding the forest in pitch blackness. Mere shreds of light filtered through the canopy, only to be consumed by the suffocating gloom. The darkness was tangible, a physical presence that could temporarily blind the unwary should any sliver of brightness pierce its veil. It rendered vision utterly useless, a literal blindfold of shade. And yet, a figure streaked through this Stygian void, leaping nimbly from branch to branch with effortless grace. Far behind trailed two pursuers, one cloaked in tattered rags, the other garbed in sleek black leather armor with scarred face. Despite the distance, both moved with preternatural stealth and elegance, their very ability to navigate such murky depths a testament to their formidable skills. Wow. They're good. Northern marveled inwardly as he alighted on another branch, glancing back over his shoulder. Turning his gaze forward once more, he spotted his destination below. This distance should suffice. With the weightless grace of a falling leaf, he descended to the loamy forest floor, surveying his gloomy surroundings before uttering a single command. Dark terror. Inky black flames erupted amidst the dense darkness, bathing the area in brilliant azure hues that danced fleetingly before winking out. A malevolent presence now stood before Northern, its eyes burning with menacing crimson flames, the only facet visible amid its seamless camouflage with the perpetual night, as if the shadows themselves had sprouted a tetrad of sinister, glowing eyes. For several heartbeats, Northern studied the entity, dark terror's baleful glare raising gooseflesh along his arms. Crap. I don't think I could have won without sheer luck. The night terror had already proven immensely daunting. To face this further evolved version imbued with the vestige of the Chaos Prince. Northern shuddered inwardly. I'd probably be dead by now if I didn't unlock the unseeing eyes. Night terror was formidable, But Dark Terror was an unreasoning incarnation of purest malice, a devilish, hellion-rank monster. I can't help feeling relieved. Commanding such an unholy abomination was terrifying, yet deeply reassuring. Northern was confident that no human currently inhabiting this settlement could withstand Dark Terror's onslaught. All right then. Let's see if I'm right. Turning to the devil, he commanded, "Go forth and obliterate anything that bars your path." The devilish monster slowly pivoted, pausing briefly before surging forward like a bolt of darkness, leaving a spiderweb of cracks in its wake. Eyeing the shattered ground, a frisson of excitement trickled along Northern's spine. Let's see how this unfolds. Smiling thinly, he too sprang into motion, leaping effortlessly from trunk to branch before alighting amongst the boughs once more. Darkness swirled protectively around him, coalescing into the imposing visage of a horned devil with 4 smoldering azure eyes. Seconds later, the fearsome facade melted back into the perpetual night, rendering Northern utterly invisible. Several minutes passed before the 2 pursuing figures blurred into view. The devilish entity surged through the gloom, crimson eyes leaving blurred trails as it flowed like tendrils of smoke. A hulking, animalistic shape suddenly burst forth, extending arms that rippled with corded muscle beneath its hairless, pallid hide. Dark Terror twirled with serpentine grace, razor-edged talons flashing in a blur as it neatly decapitated the brutish monster before its grasping appendages could connect. It watched impassively as onyx blood gushed from the severed neck, the ox-like creature crumpling to its knees in a spreading pool of viscera. Averting its malefic glare, it languidly surveyed its surroundings. 2 more of the bovine critters materialized from the murk, encircling the devil in a crude attempt to trap it. One rumbled an earth-shaking growl and charged, the ground trembling beneath its thunderous footfalls. Dark Terror remained motionless, contemptuous disdain etched into its inscrutable features as the stampeding monster barreled towards it. At the final possible instant, the devil twisted aside with negligent ease. As the rampaging beast hurtled past, Dark Terror lashed out with razored black claws, eviscerating its foe from navel to sternum in a single, sickening stroke. Steaming entrails sloughed free in a putrid tangle, the ox monster continuing its unstoppable charge to crash shoulder first through the bole of an ancient tree in a detonation of wooden shrapnel. It finally skidded to a stop, digging furrows with its horns before expiring in a gory sprawl of ruptured organs and fluids. Dark Terror cocked its head, as if bemused by this pitiful display. This bastard, Northern observed from the sheltering dark, uncertain of the fiend's intent but keenly familiar with the night terror's penchant for cruelty. If even a fraction of its former persona yet lingered within the soul now subsumed by the void, then he knew the entity was simply indulging its sadistic whims. 2 more bovine creatures came barreling through the gloom in a thunderous cadence, jaws agape to impale their adversary upon ancient horns. With an indolent pivot, Dark Terror spun between the onrushing monsters, barbed tail whipping out to transfix one through the ribcage. Bones cracked like kindling as the wicked barb punched through armored hide, erupting from the brute's back in a spray of gore. Utilizing the body as a grotesque flail, Dark Terror swung the twitching carcass, bludgeoning the remaining monster with its own kin. Skull met skull in a thunderous crunch, the force slamming the hapless beast prone as its jaws shattered, shards of bone spiking through the ruined folds of its facial hide. Dark Terror continued pummeling the creature relentlessly, reducing it to an unrecognizable, pulpy ruin. Once sated, it flicked aside the carcass with contemptuous ease before pinning the lone survivor beneath its withering, hate-filled glare. The final brute charged forth, rearing up on hind legs as it neared, thick fists raising for a brain-pulping salvo. Dark Terror did not flinch, did not move as those meaty sledgehammers descended in obliterating arcs. At the ultimate nanosecond, it flowed like smoke between the creature's brute arms, talons flashing in a blur of slashing, eviscerating strikes that butchered the monster's torso into a ruinous lattice. It crashed face first, shattered ribs impaling its own organs on brutal impact. As it jerked and thrashed, Dark Terror raked its claws along the ruin in slow, agonizing strips, parting flesh from bone with sadistic lethargy. When the spasming at last fell still, Dark Terror lifted its malevolent glare towards the 2 figures rooted before it, trembling legs belying their instinctive terror. As it studied them through those blazing crimson orbs, a thin, grotesque smile seemed to curl at the edges of its bestial maw. Oh, crap. Chapter 122 The Horror of Brimfield Estate Part 3. Chapter 121. 2 figures streaked through the darkness, their movements a blur as they rushed forward with wheeling mobility. Suddenly, their advance came to an abrupt halt as a monstrous roar tore through the forest, shattering the eerie silence. Dread etched across their faces as they exchanged a contemplative glance. The cloaked scout spoke first, his voice laced with apprehension. That must be a Bulfer. Ox-like monsters of tremendous strength. They are a terrible matchup for speed-based fighters like us. His partner, a scarred man named Vaughn, remained silent for a few heartbeats before his gaze hardened with grim determination. We're going forward. But Vaughn, Flynn protested, a Bulfer is a beast-rank monster. Even as nomad ranks, challenging one seems foolish, doesn't it? Vaughn scowled, his jaw set. Headmaster Gilbert entrusted us with an important task, to witness the capabilities of the stranger who survived a Tier 5 rift for 6 months. You want us to abandon that chance because you're scared. Flynn frowned, averting his eyes. I never said I was scared. I don't care what you said, Vaughn retorted, grabbing Flynn's shoulder in a firm grip. Flynn, man up. When exactly do you plan to become strong if you keep acting like a twerp? As Vaughn addressed him, Flynn lowered his head, his grip tightening with trembling force. You have an A-class talent of stealth, Flynn. I've seen the potential for true power in you these past 6 months that I've met you. But if you let fear grip you like this, you'll never amount to anything, just a coward. Vaughn's words hung heavy in the air before he continued, his tone softer. We're going after the Bulfer. The stranger must have engaged it already. This is our chance to observe his abilities firsthand and report back to the headmaster. It's not that I'm scared, Flynn murmured, but Vaughn cut him off with a reassuring smile. Don't worry, I understand. Let's move. With a curt nod, the pair shot forward once more, their swift strides carrying them deeper into the forest. As they closed the distance, the thunderous cries of battling monsters grew louder, punctuated by the sickening crunch of rending flesh and splintering bone. Finally, they skidded to an abrupt halt, their eyes widening at the macabre scene unfolding before them. A sinister, inhuman creature raked its claws along a Bulfer's hide in slow, agonizing strips, parting flesh from bone with sadistic lethargy. Blood-curdling terror gripped them by the heart, their blood running cold as their faces paled. Their legs trembled, rendering the simple act of standing a Herculean task. The terrifying beast turned its gaze upon them, studying them through blazing crimson orbs. A few heartbeats later, a thin, grotesque smile curled at the edges of its bestial maw. In that moment, they knew they were utterly doomed. Oh, crap. What's with the evil grin on that bastard's face? Northern thought. Northern had suspected a lingering manifestation of Night Terror's persona would remain in its soul. Witnessing its menacing, bloodthirsty behavior only cemented this suspicion further. His initial plan had been to observe how these two drifters would fare against such a monstrous entity, a bit of morbid entertainment, so to speak. Truth be told, he'd genuinely expected them to persevere, to put up a valiant fight. There were 2 of them, after all. But all his expectations shattered as he watched them frozen in abject terror, trembling like leaves in the wind as dark terror advanced upon them with the inexorable stride of death itself. Northern watched their pitiful display unfold, disappointment gnawing at him. Are they really going to do nothing? He vividly recalled his first encounter with Night Terror, how even when ambushed, he fought back with everything he had. I thought there was supposed to be a fight or flight adrenaline response, he inwardly hissed. Why are these morons just frozen? If they can't fight, they should at least flee. As Night Terror loomed over them, its crimson flames of eyes burning into their souls, the creature suddenly froze and dissipated into a writhing vortex of black flames. This is so damned annoying, Northern muttered from his vantage point on a nearby tree branch, observing with undisguised disdain as the 2 drifters crumbled to their knees. Their legs were rendered useless, their backs soaked with cold sweat. The scarred man's hands trembled uncontrollably, no matter how fiercely he gripped them. Flynn, cloaked, stared vacantly ahead, drool and beads of sweat streaming down his jaw. Northern regarded their pitiful forms for a few more seconds before melting back into the concealing embrace of darkness. With deft agility, he leapt from tree to tree until a towering mansion came into view. This must be it, he mused with a wry smile, landing lightly on the ground just outside the forest's edge. As he started forward, something gave him pause, and he glanced over his shoulder at the dense treeline. The forest is overflowing with all manner of monsters. I hope they make it back safely, he muttered, a rare flicker of concern crossing his features. Turning his attention to his immediate surroundings, he noted the odd absence of any hostile creatures in the area surrounding the mansion, just a sprawling expanse of low bushes. Weird. His gaze shifted between the teeming forest and the foreboding structure, a contemplative frown creasing his brow. Plenty of monsters lurk within those woods, yet they don't venture beyond its boundaries. Either they vastly prefer that terrain, or... His eyes narrowed slightly as they settled on the mansion once more. There's something far more dangerous lying in wait inside that place. The memory of the rampaging Bulfers resurfaced, hardened warriors of the Red Mine Kingdom that had battled such oxen. Like monstrosities on open ground countless times. I've fought those ox-headed beasts extensively in the Rift, Northern murmured. While they do favor forested areas, they don't outright avoid open spaces. As the pieces fell into place, a wide, feral grin split his face. There's something stronger inside that's keeping them at bay. With eager anticipation thrumming through his veins, Northern strode forward. Perhaps, he too, would finally get some chance to show off his abilities. Chapter 123 Who is the true horror now? Part 1. Amidst the vast, gloomy landscapes, the colossal mansion stood as an opulent architectural marvel, yet its former glory was now a haunting reminder of bygone times. Once magnificent, the opulent edifice had fallen into a sinister ruin, ravaged by decades of neglect. Ivy snaked up the crumbling walls, obscuring the intricate carvings that once adorned the facade. Windows, once welcoming sunlight, now stood shattered and hollow, their frames twisted and contorted. The ornate roof, a crown of grandeur, sagged under the weight of time and decay. As Northern stepped through the dilapidated entrance, an ominous darkness enveloped him, as if sentient shadows guarded the mansion, bidding him to retreat. Oh, quite strong, he mused, unfazed by the foreboding atmosphere. Dust and debris littered the once pristine halls, the echoes of footsteps reverberating through the cavernous spaces. Northern stared deep into the hall, his form almost blending with the darkness itself. However, a sliver of light from the strange pair of moons managed to crawl in through the open entrance, barely illuminating the middle of the hall. Northern paused, surveying his surroundings. Everywhere, darkness and cobwebs reigned supreme. The darkness itself felt extraordinary, a premonition tugging at his instincts. My gut is right, there is something here. But it's strange. Usually, he would have sensed it vividly, but this time, all he had was a vague inkling. Anyways, this could be a very good opportunity to put my abilities into practical use and see just how strong they are, Northern muttered beneath his breath. Following his intuition, Northern trekked deeper into the mansion, bypassing the whirling stairs that led to the upper floors on both sides. Towards the center, beneath the stairs, the hall delved into a deeper darkness, where a terrifying creature lurked. Northern paused, frowning slightly. Oh crap, it's a Hellion rank for sure. Having faced many such beings, he could discern their power immediately. And probably a disaster rank, max a calamity rank. As strong as Night Terror before he consumed the vestige of the Chaos Prince, maybe. A smile curved his lips as he caressed his chin. These were insights he could not have gleaned before. Maybe my sense of danger has been sharpened after facing a Maelstrom rank. Indeed, he had battled a Maelstrom rank monster and an evolving Hellion rank immediately after. It would be odd if he could not gauge their strength now. All right, friend, let's have it, Northern grinned, extending his hand in challenge. As if responding to his provocation, the terrific creature slowly crawled out of the darkness. Its hulking form was covered in thick, armored scales of lustrous inky blackness. A forced grin parted Northern's lips as he craned his neck to envisage the creature. Crap, I need to get taller. Its elongated body rose to an imposing height of around 6.75 feet, 205 centimeters. With its sheer size alone, it boasted immense strength, appearing capable of overpowering multiple trained soldiers in combat. Taut muscles rolled beneath its skin like rigid snakes. Its most chilling aspect was the line of glowing red eyes that hid within its gaping maw. 5 baleful, unblinking orbs stared soullessly at Northern, hinting at an ineffable intelligence and malice dwelling within this abhorrent form. The longer he examined those unnatural, burning eyes, the more a sense of primal dread settled in. At the edge of its grotesque maw was a row of serrated teeth, clearly adapted for gripping, tearing, and dismembering unfortunate prey. And a slightly long appendage snaked out. Northern stared blankly for a couple of seconds. This is quite strange. I've never seen a monster have its eyes in its mouth. He wasn't even sure if those were eyes. Something about it looks familiar. Like he had fought a similar monster before, but he was certain he would have remembered. The foreboding creature exuded a chilling air of primal savagery and the ruthlessness of a killer, making even Northern shudder for a second. They stood apart for a few tense moments, sizing each other up. Then, the monster moved. Northern's eyes flung open, barely catching the monster's lightning-fast movement. Perhaps he had underestimated it due to his newfound abilities. Belatedly crossing his arms, he was rammed by the monster's head, the impact throwing him out of the deep hull to tumble like a log on the ground. Coughing and vomiting crimson blood, he struggled to stand. Crap. That was one hell of a blow. A wide grin parted his lips. Looks like this is going to be an even grander battle than I thought. He sprawled to his feet, malice glimmering in his eyes. Clasping his hands into fists, he shot to the side as the monster reappeared. Hauling a swift kick, he twirled through the air, his feet bolting against the monster's thick skin before slamming it onto the ground, causing it to rebound like an elastic ball. Seizing the moment, Northern delved an elbow strike into the exposed flank of the monster, causing it to crash into the marble floor. All this happened so swiftly, no mundane eyes could have followed the sequence. Northern stood upright, stretching his body. Wow, it feels so good to be in perfect control of my body. And this armor is so great. I feel like my movements are even easier because of it. He allowed a delighted smile as the abhorrent monster stood up. Releasing a soft, eerie growl with smoke crawling out of its maw, the monster shot at him again. However, Northern was ready this time. He took the blow with one arm, the Night Terror armor absorbing the damage. Then, hauling the other hand towards the monster, he opened his fist. A black lance materialized into his hands, and hair's breadth away from the creature, and ferociously impaled its lustrous hull, rendering it in a spray of black gore. The creature let out a deafening bestial cry and staggered back. Northern looked at the sleek, black lance protruding out of the monster's shoulder, carved from what appeared to be dark wood itself. He wore a distorted smile, his eyes gleaming with the pure menace of a demon. No. Don't die on me yet. Chapter 124 Who is the true horror now? Part 2. With a bestial roar that shook the very foundations of the decrepit hull, the monstrous abomination wrenched the obsidian lance from its shoulder, flinging it aside with contemptuous ease. Brackish blood sprayed forth, splattering the marble floor in a grotesque display of the creature's tremendous vitality. The abhorrent creature now seemed to face Northern directly, its orby eyes burrowing into his soul, dripping with a palpable ferocity that sent a chill down even his hardened spine. Unfazed, Northern's smile took on a sinister edge as he flexed his fingers, the black gauntlets creaking with anticipation. I too am just getting started, he growled, his voice dripping with sadistic glee that would have sent lesser beings fleeing in terror. In the blink of an eye, a dozen obsidian lances materialized, hovering behind him as if wielded by unseen forces. With a mere thought, they shot forward, a lethal volley aimed at the stricken monster's vital points. Yet the abhorrent monster displayed an uncanny agility for its immense size, weaving through the barrage with unnatural grace that defied its grotesque form. Its maw unhinged, revealing row upon row of serrated fangs, dripping with corrosive saliva that sizzled upon contact with the floor, leaving behind a trail of acrid smoke. Undeterred, Northern swung his hand back, materializing a black blade into it, a twisted amalgamation of metal and void essence that seemed to drink in the very light around it. He charged forth, his movements a blurring black streak, a wraith of chaos and destruction. The beast met his charge head-on, its massive frame hurtling through the air with the force of a battering ram. They collided in a thunderous clash, shockwaves rippling through the decrepit hull as blade and flesh met in a frenzy of violence. Northern's sword clove through the creature's armored hide, spraying foul ichor, yet the monster's jaws clamped down on his shoulder with bone-crushing force. Hike! He gritted his teeth. Even through his armor, he could feel the fierceness of its teeth grip, and it came as a momentary shock. With a naughty smirk curling his lips, Northern backed away from the monster as it swiped a clawed attack at him, narrowly evading the strike. He then extended his sword arm and closed his eyes for a moment, gently opening them once more. As he did, a surge of black flames enveloped the steel of mortal blade like tendrils of darkness, licking at the metal with a haunting beauty. Now that I am a drifter, I think I can do this too. Northern had seen his father perform this feat a couple of times during their haunt, and it was also something of common knowledge among their kind. Soul essence became much more refined and smooth when one became a drifter, capable of being handled tangibly, although not at the level of converting to a spiritual release. Instead, it could be used to subtly reinforce one's body or weapon, boosting speed, strength, or the sharpness of one's blade. Yet for Northern, the process was distinctly different. 1. He did not wield soul essence, but what he wielded was far more potent, void essence. 2. Even as he expended this void essence to fuel this ability, he was not directly using it. This was merely an active ability of his Flames of Chaos attribute. Just as Night Terror had used it with its claws and maws, Northern wielded it through his sword and entire body, reinforcing himself with black flames that danced around his entirety like a cloak of eternal night. In that moment, a tremendous pressure fell upon the atmosphere, palpable and suffocating, as if the very air recognized the horror that now stood before the creature. Northern was practically a wraith of black flames with 4 azure eyes burning deep within, clutching a sword of shadow flames that seemed to drink in the surrounding darkness. With each step he took, the marble floor cracked and crumbled beneath his feet, unable to bear the weight of his augmented body. The monster, momentarily stunned by the sudden surge of power emanating from Northern, hesitated in its advance, its orby eyes wide with what could only be described as primal fear. Northern's eyes glowed with an intense azure hue, reflecting the depths of the void that resided within him. He exuded an aura of malevolence, his very being transformed into an embodiment of chaos and destruction. The black flames that enveloped him danced and flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to writhe and twist in the dimly lit hall, as if reaching out with spectral claws. As the creature recovered from its initial shock, it let out a guttural snarl and lunged towards Northern once again. Its claws, sharp as razors, swiped through the air, aiming to tear through the flesh of this flaming being that had so suddenly manifested before it. But Northern, empowered by the flames of chaos, moved with bullet speed, evading the creature's attacks with an almost ethereal grace. With a swift and fluid motion, Northern swung his flaming sword, the black flames trailing behind it like a comet's tail. The blade connected with the monster's hide, slicing through the thick armor as if it were paper. Dark, viscous blood sprayed into the air, mingling with the brackish ichor that stained the floor in a macabre display of violence. The creature howled in pain, a deafening sound that reverberated through the hall, shaking the very foundations of the estate. It reeled back, momentarily stunned by the force of Northern's strike, its massive form staggering as it fought to maintain its balance. Northern let out a sinister laughter, the sound echoing off the walls in a haunting melody that would have chilled the blood of any who heard it. As he beheld the monster, powerless before his presence, a twisted sense of joy and ecstasy washed over him, fueled by the sheer thrill of wielding such immense power. Then he pressed forward, his movements a black blur of speed and precision. He launched a series of swift assaults, striking with calculated ferocity, each swing of his sword carving deep wounds into the creature's flesh with a disturbing ear-to-ear grin plastered on his face. The black flames cauterized the wounds, preventing any chance of regeneration, as if the very essence of chaos itself sought to snuff out any chance of healing. The monster thrashed and writhed, its movements growing sluggish as its vitality waned. The horror that had once stood at the peak of the food chain of Brimfield Estate was now being bullied by this strange human, if human he could even be called. Who now was the true horror of Brimfield? Northern, fueled by a mixture of sheer joy and ecstasy that being so powerful brought, pressed on relentlessly. His eyes burned with a madness that made the monster shudder, its orby eyes seeming to grow wider as it beheld the entity before it. Could this even be a human? It had to be a monster too, a far stronger monster, the abhorrent creature probably thought as it witnessed the display of sheer, unadulterated power. Northern slowly walked towards the monster, the cloak of flames that had shrouded his frame slowly withering away, revealing his lustrous black armor. He loomed above the beast and turned down with a stare of disdain, as if gazing upon an insect that had dared to challenge his might. You were quite entertaining, but I expected you to put up more of a fight, he sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. The creature shuddered and lowered its head, refusing to stand or continue its assault, the fight utterly beaten out of it in the face of such overwhelming power. Northern, seeing the reaction, was momentarily struck with surprise. I guess it makes sense that if a human is capable of fear, a monster should also be, he mused, a twisted smile curling his lips. The result was incredibly satisfying. I didn't even use a couple of other abilities. I just experimented using the flames of chaos. This only proved that the power of chaos and void was not to be looked down upon, a force to be reckoned with in its own right. And it sort of made Northern even more curious about the identity of the Chaos Prince. Northern paused and stared at the monster seriously for a couple of seconds. Then, a resemblance suddenly struck him, his brow furrowing in contemplation. Why does this bastard look like a corpse eater? Although it was very distinct from the ones Northern had faced in the rift, those did not have this black skin and lacked the orby, soulless eyes, they looked quite similar in other areas. Does that mean it's not an Hellion rank but a savage rank? Northern was stricken with surprise. If so, there could only be one explanation for its difference. It's either a devil, abysmal or an apex level. Chapter 125 The Terror You Don't Know About. Gilbert stood amidst 3 individuals, each exuding an aura of power and purpose. One had deep blue hair that cascaded over broad shoulders, boasting of an Olympian athletic build adorned gracefully with a blue armor that seemed to shimmer with an inner light. The next wore a casual thick coat, an indifferent cold look etched onto his features as if he had seen too much of the world's cruelties. The last was a dark-skinned lady with a tank top that only covered her ample breasts, leaving toned arms and a taut midriff exposed. She looked at Gilbert, her gray eyes brimming with an unwavering focus that spoke of a will tempered by countless battles. As he addressed all three of them, someone quickly approached and whispered something into Gilbert's ear, their words carried on hushed tones laced with urgency. Immediately, Gilbert's expression darkened, the lines of his face hardening as if etched from stone. He tried to recompose himself, forcing a calm veneer as he turned to his audience once more. "Sage Gilbert, is all well?" The blue-haired youth, Arlam, asked, his brow furrowing with concern. "All is well, Arlam. I just might need to round this up now to attend to something else," Gilbert responded, his tone even and measured, betraying none of the turmoil that now churned within him. "It's fine, Sage Gilbert. We already understand what we need to do. Besides, Master Annette should be arriving anytime soon." "I need to see her too," Vita replied, a hint of eagerness seeping into her words. Gilbert's gaze shifted to the dark-skinned lady for a couple of seconds, and a small smile tugged at the corners of his lips. "You really adore Annette despite her nature. I'm impressed, Vita." The lady smiled shyly, her cheeks flushing ever so slightly. "She's strong, and I want to be stronger. That's all that matters." Gilbert nodded in agreement, his smile widening ever so slightly. "Keep up that front, and you'll be a master too in no time." He turned to the last of them, the one who seemed so lost even though he was amongst esteemed company, his gaze distant and unfocused. "What about you, Ryan? What's up with you?" "Nothing," came the curt reply, devoid of any emotion or inflection. Gilbert's smile took on a wry edge. "As usual, you don't really say more than a word, do you?" Ryan merely nodded, his expression remaining impassive, indifferent to his environs as though he were bored by everything around him. "I'll leave you to it, then. I have to go," Gilbert said, giving them one last appraising look before turning on his heel and striding away, his movements purposeful. His face etched with a grim expression, Gilbert brisked forward, walking past groups of people that greeted him with respectful nods and murmurs of, "Sage Gilbert." After a minute or two of weaving through the crowds, he reached the familiar dark hallway and entered his private chambers, the heavy door thudding shut behind him with a sense of finality. Two individuals were seated on the couch, leaning on their knees with their heads bowed. Their faces pale as though they'd had their souls sucked out before coming here. There was one other tall man standing next to the couch, his hands pocketed, a rough beard adorning his chin as he oversaw them with sleepy eyes that nonetheless seemed to miss nothing. Gilbert strode to his table, leaned against it, and folded his arms across his chest, his gaze sweeping over the three figures before him. "They claim they saw a Hellion rank monster," the bearded man started, his voice a gruff rumble that carried the weight of countless battles. Gilbert looked at him, then shifted his gaze to the two seated figures. He would have laughed if not for their sullen expressions and the way they trembled, as if still gripped by the throes of some unspeakable horror. The way they carried themselves, the haunted look in their eyes, told Gilbert that they weren't just spouting idle words. They must have genuinely seen a Hellion rank monster. Another reason why he couldn't doubt their report was the man with the scarred face, Vaughn, one of the best drifters among the natives of Lothaliwan. According to what they had said, he used to be an elite member of the kingdom's scout knights. On top of that, he possessed an ability that allowed him to discern the rank or strength of drifters or monsters at a mere glance. So if he said it was a Hellion rank, he couldn't be lying. Gilbert sighed, a heavy exhalation that seemed to carry the weight of the world upon his shoulders. "But there have never been a Hellion rank monster at all in these plains. We've never encountered one. If we did, we wouldn't even be alive right now." Gilbert was torn, unsure of what to believe. He sighed once again and finally spoke, calling out, "Vaughn." The scarred-faced man shakily looked up, bowing his head respectfully as he responded, his voice tinged with evident fear. "Sage Gilbert, can you calm down and report what you saw to me?" Gilbert asked, his tone even and reassuring, a balm against the palpable dread that now seemed to permeate the very air. "We were following the TT target," Vaughn stuttered, struggling to maintain his composure before finding his flow once more. "Then when he got to Brimfield Estates Gate, he disappeared all of a sudden. And so we followed. We were pursuing when we suddenly heard a monster's roar. We thought it was the target fighting a monster. The young drifter, Flynn, suddenly erupted, leaping to his feet and screaming at the scarred-faced man, his eyes wild and accusing. "I told you. But you insisted. You acted all tough. You said I had to grow up. You acted like something was wrong with me. Stop. Gilbert's voice soared across the room, a thunderous command that put a stop to Flynn's tantrum, the weight of his authority crashing down like a tidal wave. Sit, Gilbert commanded, his tone brooking no argument. With an attitude of sullen defiance, Flynn eventually sank back down onto the couch, biting his lips as his eyes remained glued to the ground, smoldering with impotent rage. I'm not sure what happened to you two, Gilbert said, his gaze sweeping over them with a measure of pity and concern. But it's clear that both of you are not in the right state of mind to give a proper report. That is one. He lingered, letting his words sink in before continuing. Two is, there is an apex-level savage rank monster in that estate. Although we last confirmed it in the mansion, there is every possibility that it might have stepped outside to hunt other monsters, and you encountered it. No. Vaughn protested fiercely, his eyes blazing with a fervor that caused Gilbert's brow to raise in surprise. You don't know. You didn't see it. I know what I saw. It was a devil-level hellion rank. I swear, it is the strongest monster I have ever seen in my entire life. Gilbert's brow creased into a tense frown, his features hardening once more. A devil-level hellion rank. Can you even hear yourself, Vaughn? The man's face paled further, his eyes growing wider with each passing second as the memory of what he had witnessed seemed to claw its way back to the forefront of his mind. It might be hard to believe, but I swear it was true. What we saw was not a savage rank, it was a hellion rank, a devil. I swear that thing will single-handedly wipe out all of us. Gilbert watched coldly as the man freaked out, his body trembling with the force of his conviction. After a few tense seconds, he let out a weary sigh, the weight of the world seeming to settle upon his shoulders once more. Perhaps I gave the job to the wrong set of people, he said, his voice heavy with resignation. See them out, Gustav. The man with the sleepy eyes, Gustav, nodded and looked at the two scouts, his gaze impassive. They sluggishly stood up, and he helped them open the door, their movements sluggish and uncoordinated, as if they were still trapped in the throes of some waking nightmare. Then he closed it back and faced the headmaster. Gilbert released his folded hands and turned away from the couch, to his chair, leaning on the table and letting out an exasperated sigh. Do you really think they are lying? Gustav asked. Gilbert was silent for a few beats before he responded. I don't know exactly what to think. I am confused myself. If they insist that what they saw was a hellion rank, then it must have been true somehow. Even if it isn't true, they must have seen something. I see, Gilbert added. But what I am curious about is the state of our guest. If that horror could make experienced drifters like this, what about the rookie who just came out of a rift? I can't but feel like something is strongly amiss. Chapter 126 The Situation as It Might Be. Chapter 126. Northern stood before the terrifying monster, arms folded across his chest. I'm not sure what to do with this guy. Killing it would be a waste. Besides, a wry smile crept onto his face. Single quote. The headmaster must have left this as some kind of welcome package for me. Annette had mentioned it that the place was swarming with monsters. The headmaster gave him this place, knowing fully well that a powerful monster dwelled within. Northern couldn't help but admire the old man's boldness. He probably did it to see if Northern could defeat the monster, or expected him to turn tail and flee. He did have an actual tail, after all. It will be boring to give him what he's expecting, won't it? That'd be utterly unmodest. Northern looked down at the shuddering creature and sighed. I've decided to spare your life. His voice rumbled in the monster tongue. The beast immediately glanced up, drinking in Northern's imposing form. Ever since coming into existence and growing stronger by consuming its kin, it had never heard a voice unmolested. All that echoed in its mind was the maddening urge to destroy and kill, the only voice controlling all monsters. The insane call that compelled their obedience. So to hear another voice, one belonging to a monstrous being far greater than itself, was like divine salvation. Northern's powerful timbre overwhelmed the madness ringing in its head. The abhorrent creature's eyes gleamed with reverence. Observing the shift, Northern arched a brow, his tone dripping disgust. You better not act funny. No, don't do that. He didn't plan on befriending another monster like Night Terror. Didn't plan on befriending any monster at all. He had no desire to pen stories about he and humanity's nemesis becoming best of buddies. And strangely, that possibility annoyed him more because he felt powerless to avoid it. He could consume their souls, materialize them. He'd probably end up traveling with hordes of monsters nipping at his heels later on. Maybe that was another cruel joke fate planned to play. And Northern hated it. He craved incredible strength, yes. But he also yearned for normalcy, maybe a bit of craziness attached to it. Inhaling deeply, he schooled his expression, addressing the creature coolly. I'll spare you, and you'll continue whatever you're doing here, undisturbed. Just make sure our paths don't cross again. The monster nodded vigorously. Great. It understands. Looks like this monster language came in handy. With a dismissive wave, Northern gestured for it to leave. The abhorrent beast hurled itself backward into the deeper hall, disappearing into the embrace of darkness. Afterward, Northern surveyed the area, the cracks, the gore staining the ground. He considered how to explain the situation to Gilbert and his people, should they arrive. I guess I'll just tell them I fought it but couldn't win, so I ran away. Not like he sought their approval anyway. Now to finding myself a nice place to settle. I need about a week's rest after these past 6 months. He turned left towards the stairs, his armor disintegrating in a shower of black flames, revealing a pale, shirtless torso and once white pants now stained black. Northern spent a few minutes exploring the mansion's upper floor, finding 17 rooms. Incredibly large ones. It made him think that whoever owned the place must have been incredibly wealthy, likely a duke of the Lothaliwan kingdom. I wonder what happened to the nobles and the king himself. With such widespread devastation, chances were they'd perished. The monster plague had ravaged the land for at least 20 years, from what the rumors he heard as a kid. A small part was what he'd experienced himself. In fact, a small part of it was what he got to experience. It isn't far-fetched to say that the kingdom of Red Mine had lesser amount of monsters in the entire 3 distinct races of monster that it continually went to war with. Their only saving grace was that their monsters were stronger. The weakest of them were beast ranks, while their foes were much more weaker, many being fiend ranks. Had he fought against the kingdom of Red Mine's monsters, he might have reached 1,000 fragments much sooner than he did, or worse, he might have died. But after all those battles in blinded madness, Northern had wondered why he took so long to evolve and seen a reason as to why he had to pay attention to how the fragments are harvested. It was one of the reasons why he was chilling and not killing anything yet. Back in Rift, the monsters were either weak, or he didn't slay as many as he thought he did. But it all worked out in the end. The others may be weaker individually, but their sheer numbers are overwhelming. Factoring that in, it makes sense they overwhelmed us on the battlefield. Still, the presence of a 5th rift. And it shattered immediately. Northern ruminated on the pieces of information he received from Gilbert. While the headmaster spoke to him, he mentioned something about a 5th rift and how it shattered immediately, and since then it had continually bothered Northern. He couldn't help but think about the rift he and Night Terror encountered on their way to the kingdom of Red Mine. Could it have been possible that that was the rift that linked other rifts to the Tier 5 rift and vice versa? It was also very possible that the 4 cardinal rifts corresponded to dimensions housing the 4 different monster races, the kingdom of Red Mine included. With the kingdom of Red Mine gone, that leaves 3, I guess. And each probably has kingdoms with guardians too, the rest would probably be easier to deal with compared to Red Mine's kingdom. But something felt deeply amiss. He stood motionless for several long minutes, ruminating. Then his head shot up. Call. Yes, it's him, he's the strange phenomenon. I can't shake the feeling that guy's up to no good. Call had mentioned being imprisoned. And what Northern and Night Terror fought was merely an altar. And there are 2 of those altar. What if the other altar is in another rift, stirring up trouble, or worse? What if it's not in a rift? Ice crept down Northern's spine. He shuddered and shook away all his thoughts. Crap, I'm getting distracted. I need to find a damn place to live. Chapter 127 Peace in the Water. After wandering around the mansion, lost in his thoughts, Northern finally discovered a hidden staircase on the top floor. Following those stairs led him to an attic. As soon as he entered, he knew, this is it. This will be my living space from now on. Dust and cobwebs coated the once neatly organized bookshelves, the volumes within slowly deteriorating from neglect. The panes of the arched window were cracked, casting eerie shadows across the dimly lit room. A large plush bed lay at the base of the window, where perhaps a young heiress once gazed onto the outside world from its lonely embrace. Now, it lay forgotten and shredded, stuffing spilling out, succumbing to the ravages of time and disaster. Peeling paint clung to the wooden paneled walls and exposed ceiling beams. The faded, frayed blue patterned rug showed signs of rodents gnawing at the edges. The writing desk stood as a somber remnant, the lamp's bulb long burnt out, while the chair lay overturned, as if the room's last occupant departed in a rushed manner centuries ago. Northern glanced around. I'll need to do some thorough cleaning first. But that was no issue for him, not at all. Northern smiled delightedly and called out. Dark terror. Flames erupted in front of him, vomiting forth the menacing devil. He looked at Dark Terror with a beguiling smile, like he was about to do something utterly foolish. 2 clones appeared beside him, and he turned to them. Since you two are directly from me and share my memories, you should know what a broom is. I want you to lead this guy, he pointed at Dark Terror, and find some clothes and brooms. We all have thorough cleaning to do. And that bastard downstairs, make him clean the whole place. I can't live in a dirty house. Even though he'd be staying in the attic most of the time, the idea of the rest of the mansion being utterly filthy didn't sit well with him. With Dark Terror, 2 clones, and the Corpse Eater, they should be able to clean everything, and I'll take care of my room, Northern thought, nodding at the clones. They turned and headed outside, with Dark Terror following behind. Watching them descend the stairs, Northern pondered what he had just done. I didn't just make monsters do chores for me, did I? Something about that undeniable truth felt satisfying, and the fact that it felt satisfying felt scary. Northern pushed the thought aside and focused on cleaning his room. He stretched his hands and body. It's been a while since I did this. Even before his reincarnation, Northern had enjoyed cleaning. After reincarnating and growing past the age of 5, Isha was quite surprised to see him cleaning the house without being asked. It was one of the activities that made him feel relaxed, a habit that may or may not have originated from his nerdy nature. After 6 months of suffering and nearly dying during his breakthrough, there was no better relaxation than a thorough cleaning and arranging of the room that would be his new home. Of course, it wasn't an easy task. Northern collapsed onto the plush bed, opposite the table and chair. After intense cleaning, his face and body were dripping with sweat, even his pants were soaked. Having sweated so much, he now gave off an unpleasant, pungent smell. Sniffing himself, Northern recoiled in disgust, suddenly realizing, crap. I haven't bathed in 6 months. He quickly got up and opened the window. Its wooden frame creaked as he pushed it open. Then, with the agility of a monkey, he slipped out of the window and landed on the mansion's slate roof. The view up here is impressive. His skin prickled, and Northern immediately hugged himself. Damn, it's so cold. He couldn't remember the last time he had experienced a cold wind like this biting his skin. Even though it made him shiver a little, it still filled him with gladness and gratitude to be out of the endless night of the rift. Northern surveyed the surroundings, able to vividly note every detail from this distance with the unparalleled effect of his eyes. Finally, towards the southern end of the estate, hidden in a cluster of tall trees, he spotted a small lake. Just what I need. Northern smiled and jumped off the roof, rolling through the air and landing strongly on the ground. Then he dashed towards the lake while his clones, Dark Terror, and the deviant Corpse Eater cleaned the mansion. As he had anticipated, the bath in the cool lake was nice and refreshing. He thoroughly washed every part of his body and deeply rested in the cold embrace of the water, thinking about what he would do next. Now that it had turned out he was still trapped, and a group of students who should be finding their way back home were being misled by a vagrant rank, a sage for that matter. It was once again annoying. I guess I'll just have to do things on my own, and quickly too. If his suspicion was right, with the strange things he had heard Call say, the fact that he was imprisoned, 4 cardinal rifts appearing at once, and another one tearing at the center and shattering immediately, then undoubtedly, trouble was brewing. Most likely, this greatly affected the beginning of the rifts themselves. Northern guessed that it was going to be a terrifying war, one that might be unlike anything any of them had ever faced. He wasn't sure if he was ready to be that reckless. He was powerful enough to overcome whatever hurdles came his way, but he wasn't pompous and arrogant, thinking he was now invincible because of the power of chaos and void he now wielded, coupled with being able to copy talents. Northern leaned his head back on the bank's edge. I guess I'll first check around for talents to company. PY. He hadn't even completed his internal statement when he dozed off. After 6 long months, he finally had a blissful, beautiful night and woke up to a bright and serene morning. Chapter 128 Getting into it. Northern's eyes flew open, his body chilled by the cruel morning cold. Remarkably, he had managed to sleep through the night in the lake, remaining in a single position without shifting. The Northern from before entering the rift was not that kind of sleeper. He thrashed and crashed his surroundings while snoring as loudly as he could. But in that hellish realm, the prison of red mine allowed him little to no time to sleep. Even when he did sleep, he had to remain alert for his death angel's arrival. It was like those damned monsters didn't expect them to rest. Even after leaving the shackles of the prison mine and gaining a room of his own, he couldn't sleep wholeheartedly. He practically slept with one eye open, and there came a time when he had no memory of sleeping at all. Then in the cave, he had to sleep with a monster that had almost killed him before. Well, he'd be damned if he could still sleep wholeheartedly after that. Northern grunted as he pulled himself out of the water, rivulets running down his body, causing the lake's surface to dance with ripples. His pants were soaked, but he didn't mind. He glanced up at the bright sky and allowed a small, attractive smile to grace his lips. This feels nice, he mumbled, peering into the boundless white expanse of the morning sky. He never thought a time would come in his life when he would appreciate seeing the sky. Northern shrugged and summoned the eternal twilight. The puissant leather armor with white clothes wove itself around him from shards of darkness, perhaps black light, which seemed quite ominous. I wonder what people will say when they see black instead of white. Northern mused internally. Since his items always materialized with black shards before absorbing the vestige of the Chaos Prince, he figured it was probably like that. And the black light shards was an effect of wielding void essence. Another observation about the powerful leather armor, particularly its tunic, it was clean. The stains of blood from frequent battle were gone, as if it had never been there. As if the armor had been given to a dry cleaner within his soul. This wasn't the first time he had noticed it, but this confirmed the notion for him: items, when returned to the soul, could probably repair themselves. Northern considered this briefly while walking and ignoring other dangers of the forest. He had little to no information about it, so it was reckless to state it as fact. Maybe I'll just ask Instructor Anne. Honestly, it sucks not knowing anything. And yet he had come this far. Northern curled a gratified smile and continued down the narrow forest path. Now that it was day, the critters lurking within the woods seemed more cautious than usual and retreated to the deepest parts of the forest. Although he could vividly feel them, he could also sense their restraint. Perhaps fear. Could it be from night terror? Sorry, dark terror. Adjusting to calling night terror by its new name, dark terror, was actually harder than it looked. He had to deliberately remind himself of the name change anytime he was about to call upon the monster, which was quite taxing in its own way, although nothing for him to worry about. Northern thought about a couple of other things, including his plan to copy talents as early as possible and advance to the next rank. After a few minutes, he reached the mansion. Everywhere was glinting at him, squeaky clean so that he could almost see his reflection on the marble ground. He walked forward. The sets of couches and furniture that had littered the area were now arranged orderly and cleaned. Even the bloodstain from yesterday's skirmish between him and his neighbor was gone. Northern paused as he reached the hallway that led to the depth where the monster had dwelled the day before. Now, with daylight, he could see it clearly. It was just a sitting room, as large as the one after the entrance but with a mini library visible without having to walk further. I don't see that bastard around. It was no surprise that he also didn't see Dark Terror and his clones. To stay in physical form, they continually expended his void essence. And he didn't boast much of it, so throughout the night, Dark Terror had probably dissolved back into the limitless void, and the clones into his soul. But the corpse eater was nowhere to be found. Northern looked away dismissively and turned away from the second sitting room. What business is it of mine caring about where a monster is? He walked away, intending to head upstairs, but stopped. Right now, he was torn between having a lazy day and actually doing something. And it was shocking. It was almost like. Northern frowned. No, it can't be that bad. Have I been turned into a lover of hardship? Back in the rift, he always had something to do every day. Survive, train, fight, there was always something. But right now, there was nothing, and he missed the life he had before. Northern shook his head vigorously and remembered. That's right. I have to pick up Fluffy, and since I'll be going there, I might as well give them the report they want, Northern decided internally. But he hesitated, the reason being, I'm probably going to be meeting a lot of people. He wasn't sure how he'd fare before a bunch of strong drifters who had been victimized like himself. But he had no choice. I have to do what I have to do, he whispered inwardly, his eyes intensely focused on the ground. There was so much he had to get in order, so much. A night's rest is enough. I think I have to start acting, and that also means taking the courage to face other people. Even though he said that, Northern would probably still prefer not to meet them. He was the kind of guy who really valued his space and hated interactions while growing up. Before, it might have been because he felt they were kids and he was not. But now, it had just developed into a habit, causing him to be socially withdrawn. Maybe another reason was because he had spent the last few months interacting with monsters. Perhaps he was scared that he had become one, or worse, that he would interact with the humans as though they were monsters. Chapter 129 Trails of Disaster. Perhaps because of the daylight, Northern's journey back to the castle gate was serene. At one point, it almost felt too peaceful. There were no signs of life, no monsters, not even a crawling ant. The city felt deserted. In fact, he stopped at Master Annette's place to check on her, but she was not around. Then he proceeded to the castle gate. Having to pass through the crowd of shelters scattered here and there left a bitter taste in Northern's mouth. For some reason, he was reminded of homeless folks who had been victims of horrible natural disasters like earthquakes or tsunamis. There was quite a lot of that where I'm from. He dwelled momentarily on the thought of how ruinous and pitiful the people looked. But he strangled the thought a couple of seconds later. There was nothing he could do about it. The disaster had caused so much damage that no one could ever contain or prevent it. Northern could only imagine how horrendous it must have been in the beginning, a rift suddenly appearing and breeding monsters without warning. He was sure the kingdom must have put up a lot of fight. They must have held on for years before this. But still, isn't 20 years too much? Even if the monsters were enormous in quantity, these were humans. Northern scoffed at the thought of it. Humans possessed a variability that could transform anything, that could turn even the most cruel situations to their favor. They had a spirit that never lost, even though they were contained by fear, even though they cowered. There always rose among them stupid and reckless heroes who, somehow, always managed to turn things around. And so it didn't sit well that these civilizations gave into the catastrophe heralded by monsters, that they were beaten and destroyed. Perhaps they gave up before they could win. Just as Call had addressed, humans were small-minded and weak. All it could take for them to lose resolve was an overwhelming sense of dread or loss. He had to fairly consider both possibilities happening. But still, something is up here. And the more he reasoned it, the more his mind drifted to Call, which he honestly hoped was not the case, was not involved in this situation at all. Northern didn't plan to follow Gilbert's tail-chasing dream of closing down the rift, but that did not mean he would stand down should the need to hunt those monsters arise. He just didn't want to give them the notion that he was a part of them, seeing how reckless they currently were. They are not the kind of people I'd want to associate. Woof. His mind came to an abrupt halt when he heard the shout of his companion. Northern looked ahead with a hearty smile and spread his arms. Mr. Fluffy. Immediately he called. The massive wolf galloped towards him and tackled him in an embrace, both of them tumbling away. Mr. Fluffy's size had grown impressively from the last time Northern could vividly visualize. Of course, he had noticed it when he fought the beast, but its massive form hauling him down and slimy tongues delightfully licking his face made it even more apparent now. Northern giggled for a few seconds. The people around stared with pale faces, some expressions blanked by surprise. The monstrous entity that wouldn't let anyone touch it was happily licking the face of this strange guy. It didn't take long for them to evaluate that this must be the savior who made it out of the rift. Rumors about Northern had traveled quite far among the refugees, the stories twisting into different forms. Strangely though, all of these forms ended as if Northern had barely survived. Instead of respecting him, they scored him with pitiful gazes, which was, first of all, annoying when he finally got up and glanced at them. He didn't have much time to dwell on how they looked at him, though. Because the moment his eyes landed on Mr. Fluffy, they widened. Hey, my bag. Northern's lips curled into a sweet smile. Master Annette did mention it was with a bag, but I forgot. He remembered and happily caressed the soft white hair of the beast, then retrieved his bag. Thanks, buddy. I owe you one. He took a lingering glance at Mr. Fluffy's body. Scars marred several parts of its body, causing Northern to pity the creature for a moment. Life must have been pretty tough after I left, he remarked inwardly, patting the beast. Wow. Amazing. We had a guess, but to really think that you are a tamer. Northern arched his brow as the clean, manly tone entered his ears. He looked up to see a green-haired guy with a warm presence standing in front of him. The man wore a pretty smile, and his green armor was a beauty to note. He stretched out his hand to Northern and introduced himself. I'm Bram. Bram Loxon. Northern meekly received his hand and responded, Northern. Bram raised one of his green brows. Then, a few beats later, he said, I find your name quite odd. Is it a nickname? Damn you, Shin, Northern smiled with his eyes. It's not. His response was short and laced with a curt tone. Coupled with the pleasant smile on his face that hid irritation, Bram didn't need to be told to realize he had to drop it there. He took a look at the snarling wolf and drove his eyes back to Northern. You must be here for the sage Gilbert, right? Come with me. He turned to his left, where stood a tall and slender boy in mismatched pieces of armor, breastplate, vambraces, and pauldrons all of different designs. That was enough to tell that his attire wasn't a singular item but something handmade. Northern watched as Bram addressed this young man. Go fetch Raven and her sidekicks. Their guy is here. He didn't know what Bram exactly meant by their guy, but Northern could swear he sensed some kind of animosity the moment he spoke the name, Raven. However, Bram turned to him with a sincere smile adorning his lips and actually made him think. Maybe I'm just reading unnecessary meanings into his tone. He walked forward, and Northern followed, with Mr. Fluffy silently trudging behind them. Chapter 130 Meeting the Frontliners Part 1. So, North. It's okay calling you North, right? Yeah. Northern nodded as he followed Bram. They had entered the castle and were currently walking amongst the throng, having to endure the wicked odors from different people. Some very wicked odors indeed. Which country are you from? Bram asked as he skillfully navigated their way. One could tell he was used to this atmosphere. Getting used to a place like this. I don't know which is more wicked, this or the kingdom of Red Mine. He exhaled sharply before responding to Bram. Verulania. Bram's eyes circled. Wow. Pretty cool, you're from the impregnable kingdom of Verulania. Interesting. Yeah, but I lived in the countryside though, the capital border to be precise. Northern caught a glimpse of a disdainful look, but Bram was wearing a warm smile before he could confirm. Did I imagine it? Interesting. A countryside boy. You must have had an incredibly high-class talent to be accepted into the academy. Not really, Northern replied, his eyes swaying from Bram, his voice devoid of energy. This conversation is beginning to get on my nerves. More like he could tell what Bram was getting at as their conversation continued. Even though Bram had a warm and welcoming smile, something about him made Northern feel uncomfortable. And he couldn't pinpoint it, but at least he could tell. He could smell the pretense, the facade in Bram's voice as he tried to sound sincere despite being displeased and disgusted by Northern. What Northern didn't understand, however, was why Bram was going through the trouble of doing so. If you're disgusted with someone, just say it. What's with all this nonsense bootlicking? Perhaps Bram was afraid. Or maybe he was just cautious. Northern had gauged him in their first few seconds of meeting, and he could tell that Bram was impressive in his own way. Although he couldn't exactly discern what rank Bram was or even gauge how strong he was, he could sense how Bram was brimming with soul essence. This was something Northern could vividly sense because of the passive effect of the vestige of chaos and void. Everything had a flow of chaos in it. And automatically sensing that flow allowed him to sense the amount of soul essence one possessed. It was also why he could gauge a being's capability to a degree, whether monsters or humans. Sensing the loose energy in his tone, Bram faced forward and led Northern across the stairs that led to the castle gate. However, a dark frown crumpled his face for a moment. Then, as he reached the guards, who crossed their swords and said to him, "The wolf can't go." Bram looked back at Northern, who already understood. He had even forgotten for a moment that Mr. Fluffy was still following them. He turned to the wolf and commanded it to stay. With a low growl, Mr. Fluffy returned to the base of the stairs, his spirit fallen. Northern and Bram then proceeded into the castle, where Bram constantly responded to greetings. I'd have been so tired if I was the one. Northern watched the drifter as he struggled to wear a warm smile every time he was greeted. From the way people regarded him, he could tell Bram was well respected around here. However, Bram was looking like the people disgusted him. And yet he was smiling at them. I can't understand the way he's thinking. Soon they entered a hallway to their left and went up the stairs that led to another open hallway. At the end was a large ornate door. Bram stopped in front of it and knocked, smiling at Northern, who looked at him indifferently. Half a second after knocking, the door creaked inward, inviting both of them in. They were received by an enormous hall, but it was nowhere near the main hall where people had turned to sheltering. However, it was grand in its own way too, but most of what adorned it were just antiques that had lost their value. In the center of the hall was a long table with chairs on both sides and one chair at the end, towards the throne seat. The door was pushed open by guards in different armors that looked quite dignified, unlike Bram's subordinate from before. 3 individuals were currently occupying seats at the table, with ladies here and there cleaning around. I'm impressed. Somehow, Gilbert had managed to hold this place together or, better still, put it together in 6 months. The way the guards operated, the way people acted around. Of course, there were bound to be discrepancies, but at the very core of this haven, Northern could find order. Even in how people respected Bram and the guards. Now, a long table of some sort, and a meeting room. Looks like someone has been busy playing Kingdom while I was dying. Immediately they entered, the attention of the three individuals sitting at the table turned to them. All of them could see a white-haired boy in brown armor that overflowed with a white tunic. They cast scrutinizing gazes on him, but Northern didn't mind. He didn't care if any of them had an ability that could burrow into his soul and tell that he had no soul essence. Wait, I do care. I mean, I'd love to copy it. Yeah. Except that. HMPH. This must be the survivor of the rift, a guy in a blue, sumptuous armor that left his broad chest and abs exposed sneered and stood up as Northern made it closer to the table. Bram's eyes crinkled, strained lines forming beneath them. Watch your manners, Arlam. This guy is our esteemed guest. Or what? You're gonna beat me, daddy long legs. Bram glared silently at the brawny guy opposite him, the atmosphere between both of them crackling with tension. Northern rolled his eyes. Of course, I'm with humans, there'll be beefs. He looked at both of them and smiled. It was a good sight. However, it was short-lived. The door slowly crept open, revealing a lithe young lady with crimson eyes and black hair that swayed gently in the wind as she strode forward. Immediately she and a white-haired girl entered, the entire atmosphere suddenly became tamed. Bram looked away, quickly strangling the tension that hung around. The same could be observed with the guy named Arlam. He clicked his tongue and walked away, returning to his seat. Chapter 131 Meeting the Frontliners Part 2. The hall became silent as Raven and her friend entered. Arlam took his seat and leaned back on the chair, ignoring the newcomers. While Bram turned around, squeezing out a warm smile as Northern had observed him. Bram, Raven greeted him curtly. Then she turned to Northern, her eyes betraying no emotion. Lael. Northern was struck by a turmoil of emotions, a rigid vein visible on his forehead as he smiled with his eyes and replied coolly. I'd appreciate it if you do not call me that. Having Raven call him a name only his mother was allowed to use for some reason was utterly annoying. His pride wouldn't allow it. The young lady's cold voice rolled out. Except you have something better than Northern. Northern raised a brow. Should I be angry with her? It looks like she's insulting me. At the same time, it also looked like Raven was being sincere. Terrence watched from the sidelines, biting her nails as her eyes shot between Northern and Raven. What do I do? What do I do? What do I do? Master Annette was also not here to save the day. Northern and Raven were now locked in a battle of stares. The former frowned darkly while the latter stared blankly. The door creaked open again, and more people began to pour into the hall, carrying themselves with distinct faces, armors, features, and expressions. All having one thing in common, strength. And Northern could tell that much. All of them in this hall, he didn't know what they had been through either. That they weren't forged in his hell didn't mean they weren't forged in hell. From now on, it'd be best to proceed with extreme caution. Not that he was being cowardly. I don't know a lot, it'd be stupid of me to go ahead boasting incredible strength. He looked around, seeing people hang out with each other, talking. Some of them settled at the table and silently waited for the arrival of others. Soon, the door opened again, and the final set of people trudged inward, Gilbert, Annette, and the twins included. Immediately they saw him, their eyes lit up. It really is the anomaly, one of them said. As it was still hard to tell the difference between them. Their black hair was both shoulder length, their indigo eyes equally cold and sharp, almost cutting into Northern. They both neared him inquisitively, leaning their heads forward and causing Northern to pull his head back a little. Gilbert tells us that you just came from a Tier 5 rift. How'd you survive? The second one, wearing red sleek armor, asked. Northern smiled. Isn't that what we are here to discuss? He replied calmly. Even though he looked flustered, his reply didn't show it. Everyone around was also observing him one way or another with piercing gazes. Stop staring. Goddammit. The twins yelled simultaneously, causing them all to shift their gazes away like they'd been caught misbehaving. Sit, both of you, Gilbert commanded as he strode past them. They pouted their mouths and tossed their heads, walking in perfect rhythm to their seats. Northern watched with amazement as their movements synchronized so perfectly and thought. They'll make a deadly combo. By the time Gilbert settled at the head of the table, all of them were already seated, except Annette, who led Northern to his seat on Gilbert's left side, next to her and opposite Terrence, who was seated next to Raven. And Raven was seated next to the headmaster on his right, while Annette was on his left. Immediately they all settled down, the ladies cleaning the hall were all gone. Right from when Raven entered, they had begun rounding up their tasks. A grave silence frowned upon the hall for a few seconds before Gilbert's thick voice rolled through. So, as you all may already have known, we have an important guest with us. I apologize for the impromptu meeting, by the way. It is best that we all listen and judge what he will tell us together, he weighed in. The others nodded in agreement, but all maintained that perfect decorum. Gilbert continued. We all were witnesses to how this man here, called Northern, is the sole survivor of a Tier 5 rift. We saw the amount of monsters that were killed and the kind of disaster that transpired in the rift. Yet he managed to survive. As much as I am, I'm sure you all are curious how. Everyone at the table responded with intense focus. Even Arlem, who seemed like a troublesome fellow, was focused on Gilbert as he spoke. Although he decided that he had no interest in joining our ranks and wants to act alone to find a way home, because of this, he prefers to use this information to do a trade. We've given him a part payment and will be giving him the rest today as well. Murmurs rolled across the hall but died down as soon as Gilbert's voice was heard again. And he is also here to give us the information about the gate that we need. Gilbert spoke, extending his hand to Northern and gesturing for him to speak. Northern gulped and was about to start, but Gilbert's voice interrupted him. Except you have a vocal strength like mine, you'd have to stand up so everyone can hear your voice. Northern frowned slightly for a brief second and stood up. And as expected, an overwhelming feeling washed over him, staring at these different faces and expressions. His stomach churned, his palms got clammy, and he was scared he was going to stutter should he open his mouth. He lowered his head. I'm not about to disgrace myself, he gritted inwardly and clenched his wet palms. After that, he raised his head and looked at them intensely, his eyes sparkling with a subtle glow of azure lights. He could see the majority of them curling the corners of their lips. Not minding what they currently thought, he started, with a trembling voice. After the mysterious glow in the academy hall where we all assembled, I opened my eyes in a desolate land. Northern paused and looked down, then he looked up, wafting his eyes along theirs. Then he corrected. No, a desolate land is not the word. It was Gehenna. Chapter 132 Gehenna. There was a tale that even a peasant was privileged to hear. It was told across all nations, clans, and classes of people. It was a history that divided the world into the 5 distinct continents as we know them today. It was a story of destruction and chaos, the story of the first major rift shattering. Humans, at that point, were just getting used to the changes and anomalies brought by rifts. They were adjusting. Then, a rift far stronger than any they had conquered so far appeared. Historians claim it may have been a Tier 6 rift, while some ancient scribes insist it was a Tier 5 or IV. However, there was no way to truly know what tier of rift it was, as humans at that time had not yet discovered the trick to discerning the tiers of rifts. The world was united back then and fought as one. But the disaster was so great that it cut the world's population in half. Humans and several other races perished while trying to conquer it. When it was eventually conquered, people gained an enormous boost in strength, becoming far stronger than they had ever been. There were surplus resources, but some wanted to monopolize them, while others wanted to share them equally. Eventually, none could reach a common understanding, and all parted ways with different rewards and resources harvested from the rift. This marked the start of territory distribution. The Central Plains was, in fact, the last continent to be formed. However, due to the influence of the first Drifters, Training Institute, the Academy, its influence spread quickly. The point was, over time, Gehenna had become a phrase to describe how gruesome a thing is. Mothers used it to tell their kids scary stories at night. The horrors of monsters encountered, the helpless deaths, so much so that it instilled a sense of dread in people worldwide when they heard the word, Gehenna. So when Northern said the word, he created a perfect picture of dread in their heads. Folding his arms, Arlem shattered the silence, his cocky voice ringing through. Do you even know what you're saying? Gehenna. I'm pretty sure that rift you were in was Tier 3 at some point, isn't that right, Eric? He inquired, turning to the scrawny boy with round glasses opposite him. Eric, caught by surprise, swallowed his spit. Before he could speak, however, Northern's hoarse and straightforward voice resounded. It was a war between monsters. Northern started, his tone cold and dreadful. Even as he continued, they could feel the weight of each word that proceeded from his mouth. For a walker who had never been into a rift, who knows nothing about monsters and rifts, can you give a better explanation of Gehenna than seeing a land that stretched far and wide, joining the horizon, filled with corpses and blood? His facial expression contorted into a frown as he regarded them all. Murmurs traveled across the table. At this point, their tough and scrutinizing expressions slowly began to shatter. Northern opened his mouth, his words carrying even more dread. It was a dayless realm. There was no way to tell time apart. The night sky was constant. There was no moon or star. Everywhere was shrouded in darkness. The atmosphere became heavy. A couple of hours after I entered the rift, I was attacked by a Hellion rank monster. Night terror. He could see the surprise creep up on their faces. Some looked at him with skeptical frowns. It was quite understandable that people would think he was lying. He didn't expect anyone to believe him. In fact, it would work to his advantage if they didn't believe him, since they would also not believe or ever think that he truly is as strong as he is now. But since they would be holding up their end of the bargain, he owed them the truth. Young lad, are you sure? A Hellion rank monster. And you were a walker. I think he's lying about being a walker. Arlem interrupted fiercely, his brows furrowed into a frown. Everyone started to murmur. Some were indifferent. Arlem, it's really wrong to be interrupting the headmaster during his sentence. Arlem shrank back as the voice from the right of the headmaster rang out. He looked away with a bead of sweat upon his face. I'm sorry, headmaster. Gilbert ignored him and turned to Terence. What do you think? She nodded her head with a stern stare back at him. Observing them, Northern chuckled internally. So, that's her. He had figured that Gilbert would most likely bring someone with the ability to sense lies or tell when someone was telling the truth. Just as he didn't expect anyone to believe him, he didn't expect the headmaster to, either. He was sure there would be someone who could perceive lies. Northern had been deeply thinking about what abilities to copy since he was dealing with humans going forward. He wanted to be careful and have abilities that would shield him from betrayal or falling into traps. He had decided which abilities to have his eyes on first. He cast one last careful look at Terence before averting his gaze as he continued addressing them. You were there, Headmaster Gilbert. My talent evaluation was right before your eyes. So yes, I was a walker. And I survived because it decided not to kill me. Instead, it took me to a prison mine. Gilbert frowned. Monsters have a mine. Northern allowed a small smile. They have a kingdom, in fact. Gilbert raised a skeptical brow and turned to Terence, who responded with a nod. Northern's eyes lingered keenly on her for that brief moment, trying to discern what she had done. But there was nothing. No message from his system that he had copied a new talent. Maybe I should pay attention early enough, so I won't miss whatever time she uses the ability. Since he suspected it was a mental ability, he didn't expect to see a physical sign that she had used it. He would focus on her alone for now. So you were taken to a monster kingdom. Most likely where we found you. Northern nodded, with a serious look, sparing it to Gilbert for a second before returning his eyes to Terence. Gilbert's voice crawled out again. And what were they mining? Northern brought his eyes to Gilbert, then dipped his hand behind the breastplate of the eternal twilight and brought out a red crystal, then placed it on the table. This. Chapter 133 Tales of a 15-year-old that walked through hell. Gilbert's fingers softly caressed the crimson crystal, his eyes studying it intensely before raising them to meet Northern's gaze. And this is? He asked, an inquisitive brow arched. A red crystal, Northern responded. I don't know if it has a special name, but it's a crystal with healing properties. Gilbert's eyes widened in surprise, mirrored by the flabbergasted expressions contorting the faces of those around the table. Although, Northern added, his tone laced with a hint of caution, I also think it comes with a side effect. Gilbert's hand stilled, and he ceased his inspection of the crystal, lifting his head to regard Northern with a furrowed brow. A side effect. Northern nodded solemnly. Yes, I think it has a tendency to make someone mad, or at least susceptible to darkness and malice. What do you mean? Gilbert's voice carried a note of confusion. I don't understand. Northern inhaled deeply, then exhaled, his features hardening as he began to explain. I've not been in rifts many times, but I've heard a thing or two from my mother. Rifts are supposed to be broken dimensions. To close down a rift, one must find its core, and to find the core, it's crucial to understand the history of that dimension, ultimately, what led to its demise. Isn't that right? Murmurs rippled through the gathered individuals, causing Northern to glance around uncertainly, unsure if his understanding was correct. Gilbert's voice cut through the low hum, commanding attention. While you are right, there are also some things you need to be corrected on. The word is not dimensions, but regions. See, probers postulate that rift territories are all different regions of a particular dimension. As Gilbert spoke, Northern's eyes narrowed in contemplation. So while each rift might be different, we think they are all different regions. There have been cases of the same region appearing in multiple rifts. Northern's brow furrowed deeper. I don't know what prober postulated that theory, but it doesn't even feel right. If that were the case, how could one explain the vast, contrasting histories and conditions behind each rift? This particular one was a realm of endless night. If they were all regions of the same dimension, did it mean that there existed a region that never saw the sun's kiss, while others basked in its warmth? It sounded plausible when considering this was a world where anomalies were becoming increasingly common. But Northern wanted to believe. No, he had seen enough evidence to know that even those anomalies had a common reasoning behind them. There was no solid reason for his premonition, and yet, after striding along the ethereal weaves of the rift's reality, he could tell that they were wrong. However, those were his thoughts to hold on to for now. Northern nodded his head humbly, meeting Gilbert's gaze as the older man corrected him. So, rifts tear apart these dimensions, and these tears are what appear in our own dimension. All these resources and heritages received by different drifters are believed to have been originally owned by natives of this once united dimension. A glimmer of understanding dawned in Northern's eyes as he nodded in response. That does make a lot of sense. I guess it explains a lot of things. A small, grateful smile tugged at his lips. Thank you very much. You're welcome. Gilbert cleared his throat, a flush of embarrassment coloring his cheeks. Raven's impassive gaze flickered between the two men before settling on Northern. So, this crystal. You were explaining, she prompted, her tone devoid of emotion. Thank you. Northern's expression grew somber as he delved into his explanation. What I mean is that the underlying history of this certain region is about a mad king who killed his entire kingdom as some kind of ritual to gain unrivaled power. The kingdom is characterized by red mines. These crystals, when struck, can exude a potent bloodlust. I theorized that taking a large amount of something as such could probably increase your thirst for blood and make you slowly descend into the realm of utter madness. His gaze swept over their faces, and he added after a weighted breath, although this is my own theory based on the things I saw, I only took it in small quantities. But I think it played a major role in why I enjoyed the war there so much. Although, I do think the eyes of the castle lord, in particular, had the main effect. Wait a moment. Bro, chill. What do you mean? War. A young man with sharp, shark-like teeth and a grating, froggy voice intoned, raising both his brows in bewilderment. Northern rolled his eyes, the weight of his experiences etched lightly into the lines of his face as he recounted. Ah, that's right, there was war. We prisoners were thrown into the fray as meat shields, so the monsters from the kingdom of Red Mine could gain a moment of respite and turn the tide of the battle. But I managed to survive by feigning death and hiding myself amongst other monster corpses. Their faces crumpled into strained frowns, a mixture of fear and pity forming on some, while others regarded him with blatant distrust. Of course, Northern expected such diverse reactions. But he continued nonetheless, his words painting a vivid, haunting picture. The atmosphere grew tense and heavy as he narrated the major events that had transpired within the rift. The more he revealed, the more they looked upon him with skepticism and doubt etched into their features. Annette, however, stood apart. Her frown seemed to be a force battling to hold her expression together, to prevent the tears from spilling forth. The twins gazed at him with undisguised compassion and pity in their eyes. Terence, too, her eyes glistened with unshed tears. Gilbert paid rapt attention, though a slight frown creased his brow. It was difficult to discern his thoughts, but at some point during Northern's narration, pity for the young lad flickered across his features. Northern was barely 15 years old, yet he had endured a hell that none of them had ever seen or heard of before. None. While Northern was completely honest about the things he mentioned to them, the level of monsters, his adventures with Night Terror, he left out a couple of critical details. The vestige of the Chaos Prince. The fact that he could speak the monster tongue. The things that Call had said. He didn't even speak of Call's ability to converse. In his explanations, he carefully navigated around those subjects, taking routes that would prevent them from asking questions that could unravel those threads. Since he couldn't lie, he just didn't have to mention it. Those facts were his to hold and investigate. At least until he knew the identity of the Chaos Prince and these origins, one of which Call worshipped. Until then, they were his alone. Chapter 134 Union of Heroes. After all that Northern had said, everyone stared at him with varied expressions etched across their faces. Many clearly did not believe what he had claimed, thinking he had either exaggerated some details or was outright lying. Of course, people like Raven, Gilbert, Annette, and others who knew of Terrence's ability to discern lies and were attentive to her subtle communication with Gilbert believed him. In the end, I was not able to copy it. Northern, however, was baffled by another dilemma, the lie detecting ability. How in the world of Ul does she even activate it? As far as talent abilities went, Northern had figured that the copycat system would automatically copy an ability when he witnessed it in use. Or perhaps his entire proposition could have been wrong, since it had only happened once. Single quote single quote. At this point, he didn't know what to think anymore. He sighed and raised his head as Gilbert's thick voice cut through the silent air. It's impressive. Really, I don't even know what to say. Gilbert's gaze settled on Northern. You've been through a lot. Sorts of justified his rage towards Grandmaster Ruffsburg. Gilbert continued, I'm sure with all those wars you claim you fought while in a state of insanity, you'd be close to being a master by now. That also justifies how he was able to move like that, I guess. What has happened to you indeed is a curse, but I suppose it was also a blessing in a way. The rift you said you encountered within the rift while journeying with this, your monster friend, EHM. Night Terror. Northern provided. Thank you, Night Terror. You really didn't confirm where it led to. Northern responded sternly. I already told you. I couldn't have if I wanted to. I was traveling with a monster that was counting on me to help it kill its boss. The only thing that kept that horror from killing me was because I was useful. If I decided to suddenly enter a rift, don't you think it would have killed me even before I could move? Gilbert allowed a short chuckle. I'm sorry if I sound disrespectful. You have to understand that even though all you have said is true, there are many discrepancies and irregularities when compared to what we all have known about rifts, which are facts. I'm as helpless as you are. They are just the things I saw. Gilbert caressed his rough beard. I see, but some things also make sense. When the rift in the center shattered, several kinds of monsters poured out of it, but the stories speak of four strongest. The Bulfer, the Razorlf, the Weldermorn, and the last one. Phrygians. Northern nodded his head as Gilbert counted with his fingers. Which fit the description of the monsters you say are at war with each other. You also claim to have also come across corpse eaters too. And we've also come across monsters like smoke wraiths and gorgemaws. He looked at Northern as he continued, if you say you were at war with these four major races of monsters, that would mean, some way, they could enter the rift. I see, it makes sense to deduce that the rift you saw leads to another rift. Gilbert looked around, taking in all their faces before speaking. This would mean that we know what monsters are in the other three rifts. Well, the one in the center is an issue, but it's closer to Sloria, and they've not done anything about it. For now, we'll focus on the one that could pose a threat to us. He turned his head back to Northern. Young lad, the last thing we'll need you to do is provide a comprehensive report on the monsters and their abilities. If you can't write, I can have Bram here. I can write, Northern interrupted sharply, frowning. It was understandable why they would think he was incapable of writing, as he had grown up in the outskirts of the city, where most children did not have the luxury of getting a tutor or were not considered intelligent enough to grasp such skills, if taught. The way nobles looked down on countryside folk was even more dire than this. And Northern was somewhat familiar with the game. Oh, okay, then I'll trust you to make the report. Gilbert paused for a half-second and continued, I think you can be excused with that. Since you are not a member of this union, it's only best that you excuse us while we make further plans, right? Or have you changed your mind? Everyone turned their heads toward Northern. Sly. He's one hell of a sly bastard. Northern curled a corner of his lips and let out a silent scoff. It's fine, Headmaster. I still remain firm on my decision. I'll leave now. He bowed and removed himself from the table but stopped as he was about to go further. But do not forget to uphold your end too. Gilbert smiled and responded, of course. Then Northern walked out of the hall, leaving the Union of Heroes to whatever planning they had to do. Silence ensued in the hall for a couple of seconds, even after Northern had gone completely. Then Arlem's arrogant tone shattered it all. Are we seriously going to believe that story? He inquired, folding his muscled arms. Terrence frowned and shot him a response. I was monitoring him closely, there was not a moment where he lied. It's crazy. Though, so you're telling me that guy went through all of that and is still alive? A red-haired guy noted, his eyes sparkling with astonishment. I don't think I'd be able to sleep at all knowing a monster is around me. We have to admit it. He's been through hell. Another guy, a black-colored buzz cut with bushy brows, commented. If Lady Terrence says that she detected no lie from our survivor. All eyes came on Gilbert as he took a moment of respite and continued, then I think it's only expected that we believe him. Moreover, his story correlates with some facts that we have seen around. With what he will provide about the monsters, we should be ready to challenge the next rift. Gilbert smiled and stole a glance at Raven, who sat with her usual cold expression. Well, with that, I think that should be the end of today's meeting. Do not forget to go for your hunt when it's your time. Order must be kept in this place, you hear me? His eyes drifted toward Arlem at the last second. Yes, sir, they all voiced out at the same time, their voices all muddled and rough. Chapter 135 The Boy Named Ellis. After being let out of their meeting room, Northern decided to take a look around, not because he was particularly interested in whatever they had managed to build, but because he needed to kill time somehow. Or perhaps he was interested, after all. From the open hallway that hosted the door to the meeting hall, Northern walked straight, tracing his steps through his memory of how they had reached here. After the hallway, he took the stairs down and opened a door that revealed the view of the main hall before his eyes. Murmurs and noises from different sources resumed. The place was like a bustling marketplace. Shelters were scattered here and there, and people were engaging in all sorts of business and conversations. One particular vendor was selling items for soul cores. Northern was tempted to meet him since he had some beast-rank soul cores with him, which could fetch him some very good items. But he instantly killed that thought. I have quite a lot of items. I'm not in a rush to get more. He was pretty okay with everything he had right now. He moved forward, looking elsewhere. Another vendor was selling makeshift armors. For guys that don't have enough to get real items, huh? Somehow, Northern's mind was drawn to Bram's subordinate from before. But is it really possible that some people do not have items? He paused for a couple of beats, then looked at the lean-framed boy selling the makeshift armors. He was also selling a few other items. Plates, bowls, cups, chairs. They were all arranged around him while he was seated in the middle, very close to the pathway of the hall adorned by a faded red carpet. Northern approached the vendor and looked down at the items and the boy. Do you want to buy this mundane armor? The boy smiled with his eyes. Ah ha ha, I doubt you'd want this mundane armor. The one you have on looks pretty cool already. That's right. The Eternal Twilight armor had an almost flawless appearance, its white tunic and cape giving off the feel of a divine hero. Although the white clothes had seen better days, perhaps lost their purity in the process, they were still far better than these makeshift items the boy was selling. And the seller didn't need to be told that much. You can buy other stuff. Let's see, we have EHMM. He glanced around, looking for something that might pique Northern's interest. Oh, yes, there's this, it's an alarm clock. He brought up a rectangular wooden box with glass. It must have been constructed with materials scavenged from the surplus in the castle and other magnificent buildings around the capital. Northern didn't even concern himself with the thought and simply stared at the alarm clock indifferently. It's a magnificent thing. I can't help but wonder who created it. What do I pay with? He asked. The boy's eyes glowed with enthusiasm. Anything you think you can part with. It could be an item that is useless to you. Anything would do just fine. For a second, he looked desperate. And it didn't get past Northern. The boy stared intensely at Northern, waiting for a reply. A couple of seconds later, however, his brows furrowed slowly. A spark of recognition ignited in his eyes as he looked at Northern. It's you, he suddenly shouted as he remembered clearly. Northern looked at the boy and raised a brow, glancing back and forth before pointing to himself questioningly. Me. The boy answered immediately. Yes. You. It's you, from the academy gate. Do you remember? Northern frowned slightly. He's from the academy. I had no doubt that he was a native of this continent. It was natural to think that everyone here was a native of Stellia, the Starlock continent, and the heroes of justice with their party members were students. Moreover, this boy looked nothing like a student. His hair was rough and tangled, black stains stippled across his face, and his clothes were no different from rags. Bram's subordinate from before was 100 times better off. Even though I don't know him, I'm curious. Northern allowed an accommodating smile. I'm not sure I remember you. Please, can you remind me? The boy's eyes flung open, as if butterflies had flown out of Northern's face and flushed his own. There was something about Northern's approach that pulled him in like a whirlpool. He quickly shook his head and lowered his gaze before responding. I'm Ellis Ruthworn, he said, looking away. Northern arched a brow. What's with that reaction? He refocused on the boy, recalling the name he had provided. Ellis. Ellis. I am. Northern, the boy said. Quickly before Northern could complete his sentence. Northern stared at him for a couple of seconds, his expression blank. Oh okay. Ellis, thank you for remembering me. Ellis nodded, but his eyes stayed fixed on Northern. Okay, this is getting weird. Northern looked around, visibly growing uncomfortable. Well, I don't think I'll be needing the clock. I just wanted to figure out how trade works here. Well then, I guess I'll be going. He said awkwardly, slowly moving his steps away. Actually, he didn't just want to inquire how business was done here. He had also wanted to strike a deal. After all, he needed someone to help him with all the somewhat useful but useless to him items he had. I guess I have to look for someone else. Before Northern could fully turn away, Ellis shouted, springing forth to his feet. Please wait. His voice rang through the hall, causing a momentary silence. Northern couldn't help but freeze. A second later, everything returned to how it was, the usual chatters and noise. Then Northern turned around and looked at the boy, Ellis, with a deep frown. You better have an explanation for why you shouted like that. Ellis frowned back, his face carrying unyielding determination. I had found it wrong that a prince from Lueningard was in the academy, despite the calamity that had befallen Stelia. However, after seeing you and hearing that Lueningard Empire is unaffected by this incident, I can't help but think, perhaps something is going on. Northern's frown darkened. What's this bastard going on about? Listen, I don't care about your secrets or plots. He lowered his head 90 degrees. Please help me. I need your help. He yelled. Again. Chapter 136 Ellis's Misunderstanding. Northern was overwhelmed by embarrassment. In that moment, he wished the ground would open up and swallow him whole. People glanced their way, but ultimately, they were consumed by their own business. With so much happening in this land, it would be concerning if some group had ample time to focus on others' affairs, not that such people didn't exist. Please get up, Northern requested firmly and sighed. If he didn't respond, Ellis would likely remain in that awkward position. The poor guy glanced at Northern's face before straightening his back. For a couple of seconds, they stared at each other. Then Northern spoke first. If it's okay with you, can we have this conversation somewhere else? I'm not very comfortable here. He looked around and returned his eyes to Ellis. Right, of course. Ellis quickly and roughly packed his things aside and stood upright before Northern, brimming with excitement. I'm not comfortable with his enthusiasm. What the hell? Northern thought, worried. But he discarded those thoughts and asked, do you know a place where we can talk? Of course, please follow me. Ellis said and immediately set into motion. Northern followed but spared a quick, worried glance at the haphazard state of Ellis's things. Aren't you worried about your merchandise? Won't they get stolen? Ellis responded sharply as he led the way, these things are useless. Even if they do, it wouldn't matter. A broad smile adorned his face. With your help, I'll finally be free from those bastards. His excitement brimmed once again as he clenched his fist. They walked into another hall, opposite the one that had led Northern to the meeting hall. This one was filled with more people, all of them in ragged clothing and makeshift armors like the ones Ellis had been selling. A pungent, displeasing odor filled the air, causing Northern to wrinkle his nose the moment he entered. Plus, the hall was quite narrow and dark, making it a terrible place to breathe, let alone live. There were doors to the left and right, which Northern suspected were rooms. They immediately triggered his memory of when he had woken up, and he remembered how the hall there had been. But that was in far better condition than this place. It was as if no one lived there, while this place. Northern could note some things that set this place apart. It was quite evident in how people dressed here. There was no one in brilliant-looking armor. Different people, children even, were roaming to and fro in the hallway. Some were seated on the ground with sorrow etched across their features. They made walking through the hall quite difficult. Eventually, Ellis opened a door and entered a room. The room was dark until Ellis walked towards a spot instinctively, and a dim light appeared a few seconds later, casting a warm, slight glow throughout the interior. Ellis's humble abode humbled Northern. All he had was a bed and a table. Even Northern's living condition before becoming War General Northern was way better. You can sit down, Ellis said, pointing Northern to his mattress. If it could be called a mattress. Northern gulped and looked at the blackened bed with a horrifying expression. He had probably slept on it with an extremely dirty body. Did they even bathe in this place? It wasn't to despise them. In fact, he understood best since he had been in a worse situation. But he couldn't bring himself to sit on the bed, knowing this guy may not have bathed in 6 months. He gulped and looked at Ellis, a frown dawning on his face. Until I know what it is you want, I don't think there's any reason for me to be friendly with you. It was a front, but it was also true and Northern's best excuse for not having to sit down. Besides, he was very serious about what he had said. Ellis stared blankly for a second, then nodded with a sad smile. I understand. First of all, Northern started immediately. What is this thing about the Luaningard Empire you keep talking about? I remember now, there was a guy pestering me when we were about to enter the academy. He mentioned something like Luaningard Empire then, too. Northern's face creased with a more acute, inquisitive frown. I understand that you are very suspicious of me, Ellis said. Not everyone is aware of the Luaningard royal family's distinctive features. Northern scrunched up his eyes and raised his head a bit. You're still not making any sense to me. What features? Ellis's facial expression contorted into a tiny frown as he stared keenly at Northern. What? You don't know. The white hair, exactly like yours, although yours seems to have lost its pristine whiteness, but I'm sure with thorough washing, it would be as white as snow. Northern arched a brow. What about my white hair? Ellis's expression fully contorted into a suspicious and dark frown. What? Are you not a prince of Luaningard? Northern shook his head vehemently. No, I'm no prince. What? Why didn't you say so earlier? When did I ever admit to being one? You made all those assumptions on your own. Ellis was frowning and panting heavily, while Northern frowned but maintained a calm, composed posture. A few beats later, Ellis's expression crumpled as his brows drifted upward and lines formed across his forehead. He began pacing around with both arms on his head. Damn it, damn it, damn it. I'm so dead. I'm finished. Northern watched him for a few seconds, then asked, what exactly is wrong? He wasn't concerned. In fact, he didn't want to know. Whatever Ellis needed help with sounded like trouble. And trouble was the one thing Northern wasn't ready to get into. However, he still needed to hear more about the Luaningard Empire from this young man. That Northern denied being a prince didn't mean he forgot that he was once one. The night of his birth was still fresh in his mind like yesterday. The broken expression on the white-haired lady's face, those three sisters, anytime he thought about it, his heart felt heavy. And so, unraveling the mystery behind his birth had been one silent goal he looked forward to. If this guy suspected him to be a prince at a glance because of his white hair, then there was something about this Luaningard Empire. Northern needed to know everything. Chapter 137 Ellis's Dilemma. It took an annoying couple of seconds to calm Ellis and make him talk. The boy sat on his bed, head bowed, a horrified frown deftly locked on his face. Anyone could tell Ellis was in a lot of trouble. What's the use of it all? I've even gotten myself in a lot of trouble. Shit, I even left my merchandise. Ellis sprang to his feet, about to hurry outside, but Northern grabbed him by the collar of his shirt and slammed him back onto the bed. I'm not good with words. I don't even know what to say to this bastard. Northern folded his arms and looked down with a gloomy expression. Will you speak now, or shall I leave? Ellis curled for a second from the slight ache running across his back. If Northern's grip had been any stronger, he could have broken the bed. He caressed his back and stood up, frowning, clenching trembling hands. What can you do? There's nothing you can do. I thought you were from Luaningard. I needed you to help me run away from this place. I thought with your influence as a prince, I would be able to get into the Luaningard. Damn it, I was crazy to think I was lucky since I was the only one who knew you were a prince from Luaningard, Ellis explained with a trembling voice. Ah, I see. Northern lingered for a moment before adding, why? Ellis looked at his face as he spoke again. Why do you want to run away? What's wrong? Ellis sighed and looked down. After hesitating for a few seconds, his voice finally came out. It started like 4 months ago. Northern observed keenly as he continued with trembling shoulders. He gathered a number of us since we had combat useless abilities. He said he had a way for us to earn soul cores. After all, we also needed to get stronger, so that we could unlock more abilities. Maybe we'll end up being useful somehow. Ellis took a breath and continued. He said we would be his arms and legs. He needed us to help him sell things. With some set of rules, we started. His face darkened. Well, it was fair at the beginning. We made a couple of soul cores, and it was all good, but that was only for a month. He bit his lips shakily. After a month, it all ended. His men would force us to sell some mundane things and submit all that we had received, and they wouldn't even give us soul cores as promised. When we refused, they would beat the hell out of us and even seize our ration of meat. Bullying. It existed everywhere. No matter how dire the disaster, there would always exist some nutjobs who would rise for the sole purpose of taking advantage of the weak and bullying them. Then you should have reported them, Northern offered. I'm sure if you report these guys to the party leaders, they'll offer some kind of solution. Ellis's face grew heavy and grim as he lashed out, no way. That's even worse. If we report to the party leaders, then the matter will get out. If it does, then he gets to know about it. Do you think they'll punish someone strong and useful like him? He has an ability that is so valued around here. No one can dispose of him. It will only fall back on us. Northern raised a brow as Ellis shouted, quiet down, your tone is getting annoying. For some reason, chills ran down Ellis's spine. He immediately recomposed himself, lowered his head, and apologized, I'm sorry. I guess it does make a lot of sense. The party leaders are the strongest set of people picked by the headmaster himself. It would be stupidity to dispose of them just because of some weaklings being bullied. Northern sighed. As I suspected, it is real trouble. I don't mind messing up with any of the party leaders, but I don't really see the need to. People get bullied every day, whether he interferes or not. It was a constant of life that would never change. As far as things went, Northern wasn't even aware of their abilities. Although, he was quite confident in his ability. Worst came to worst, Night Terror would finish it. He could also materialize Call's soul onto himself and decimate them all or use chaos. There were several options to end the fight, really, so he wasn't scared of any of them. But he was going to go about things the easiest route, a path that would certify his individualistic growth and the growth of his skill. He also looked forward to putting the formless attribute to use. To put it simply, Northern was in a way looking forward to fights. At the same time, he was very careful. And most importantly, he wasn't about to do anything for free. Northern closed and opened his eyes. I can help. Ellis gritted his teeth and looked away, clenching his fist. You can't. You don't know him. He's very strong. Even amongst other leaders, not more than 3 can defeat him. Northern exhaled, and immediately, the atmosphere became ridden with a tight tension. Ellis felt like his body became heavy. All of a sudden, it became a lot of work to keep standing. He tried to look into Northern's eyes, but horror gripped him by the heart. Everywhere was immersed in shadowy blackness, and behind Northern's shimmering blue eyes were 2 pairs of crimson gazes, piercing out. Ellis's facial features broke apart as sweat gathered on his face, and his legs trembled. Northern then breathed again. Everything was gone. The darkness, the monstrous glare, as though it had never happened. What was that? Ellis stammered. A little smile curved a corner of Northern's lips. Since you are so sure that no one can defeat this leader of yours, I figured I'd show you a glimpse of my ability. An unbelieving frown broke out on Ellis's face. Seriously? That was you? Those eyes? Those monstrous eyes? I felt like I would be swallowed by the darkness. Northern chuckled evilly. It's good that you know the feeling of dread, that way you can tell how dreadful I am. He closed his eyes for a moment before speaking. So, I'll tell you one last time, Ellis. I can help you. Ellis's eyes glistened. However, the joy in them was killed a second later as Northern's face became dark with a stern frown. But why should I? Chapter 138 Another Night Terror. Nah. No way. Northern folded his arms, his eyes locked on Ellis's faltering gaze. What do you mean? What do you mean why? It's injustice. If you can help, shouldn't you? Northern remained silent for a few tense minutes, his expression unreadable as Ellis frowned slightly. When he finally spoke, his hoarse voice came out first. You're stupid if you think that way. Injustice. It's a way of life. The strong eat the weak. Do you call it injustice when you kill monsters and eat their meat without worry? No, it's normal. You have to survive one way or the other. He stared intently at Ellis's face. Look, that is exactly what's happening to you right now. Those guys have to get by in life one way or another, whether it's preying on you or others. But that's injustice to you. Northern scoffed, his eyes hardening. I'm irritated. He cast one last disgusted look over Ellis's form and turned to walk out. Before he could make it through the door, a heavy thud reached his ears, as if something fell. Northern turned around to see poor Ellis on his knees, biting his lips, tears streaming down his face. Please. I beg you. Have mercy. I'll do any thing, he sobbed, his tone quaking. Northern's heart wavered a bit, but he was more logical than emotional. Even as the guy broke down begging, he focused more on the I'll do anything part than having mercy. I thought I was compassionate. What's happening to me? For a moment, Northern was afraid of what he was becoming. This emptiness he sometimes felt was becoming concerning. First, it happened with Mr. Fluffy. If he didn't deliberately caution himself, he wouldn't have minded killing the beast. And now, he didn't mind leaving this guy to his troubles. He had a fundamental belief that Ellis would live through it eventually. It was his own story. After all, no one came to his own aid either. Northern sighed. Then his voice came. Since you say you'll do anything, it's fine. I'll help you. He turned away and turned the doorknob, opening it. But you're going away. Ellis's voice quickly followed, causing Northern to look back at him. Well, yes, I am. What? Do you want me to babysit you? Or do you want to live with me? Ellis lingered for a second, then responded, his tone utterly tamed. I don't mind. Northern let out a big laugh immediately, then shook his head at Ellis. Trust me, you do mind. You'll prefer your life here. Don't worry, I'll be around. Should anything happen, just scream dark terror regardless of where you are. He waved and went off, slamming the door behind him. Ellis collapsed into a sitting position and stared blankly for a few seconds. Then he bowed his head into his hands, as if to scream, but didn't. Instead, he slammed his fist hard on the ground, instantly regretting it as his knuckles protested in cruel pain. Northern found his way back to the main hall and walked outside himself. Immediately the door opened. Mr. Fluffy's ears flew up, causing the white wolf to spring to its feet. Its eyes glistened as Northern descended the stairs, and the moment his feet touched the last step, the beast dashed at him, dancing around excitedly. Northern patted the wolf with a soft chuckle. Seriously, what am I going to do with you? It's a nice wolf, isn't it? Immediately Northern heard the voice. A sharp pressure pierced through the air, causing Northern to scowl and turn swiftly, materializing a dagger that stopped at the person's neck. Lines formed beneath his scowl before his eyes widened in recognition. Raven looked into his face and curved up a corner of her lips. But Northern was still frowning, albeit slightly. What's funny? Is she toying with me? Was the bloodlust or spiritual release? Just now, he was not mistaken. He had felt an overwhelming amount of killing intent sharp as the edge of a sword and directed at him. One that resolved him to want to slit the person's throat in one go. And he had only stopped because the moment his dagger fully materialized as his hand lashed forward, the killing intent completely disappeared. That's one hell of control. It was incredibly dangerous, but he had to admit it. I can't tell if it's bloodlust or spiritual release. Sure, I could have done something like that, but only with bloodlust. Northern had experienced bloodlust many times. Eventually he'd been able to use it too. It worked like spiritual release but could not cause physical harm, while it was very possible for spiritual release to cause physical harm. The point of spiritual release is that essences are augmented enough to tear through air. They become very dense and able to materialize while maintaining an invisible nature. Bloodlust was an actualization of one's thirst for blood. It's possible to hate a being and desire to kill that being, and the being wouldn't even notice at all. It had happened before. But when one has slain, the scent of blood begins to linger around them. It gets thicker and stronger with each blood they take, and eventually, it gets to a level where it can materialize and be felt even by mundane beings. That feeling when one can tell that death is lingering behind them even without having to look. Northern doubted if Raven was a master. If so, that would mean that what he experienced just now was her bloodlust. But this much. Just how many monsters has she killed? And controlling it to this level? Northern felt like he had just crossed path with another monster, another night terror for some reason. He didn't even know bloodlust was something that could be controlled. Nah. Let's not give her so much credit. Night terror is on another level. The smile on your lips is irritating. I'll have you get rid of it. Even with his words, Raven was still smiling, looking at him with sparkling red eyes that hid some level of coldness. Her intensive look made creeps crawl on Northern's skin. He withdrew his hand and hid it behind his back, then brought it out with no dagger. For a split second, Raven's eyes followed that movement, then she brought her gaze back to his face and finally erased her smile. Sage Gilbert asked me to provide you with whatever information you'll be needing. Northern patted Mr. Fluffy's smooth, flat head as he responded, oh, okay. I thought he'd send Instructor Annette since that'll be easier for me. Maybe something is going on between them as I guessed, and maybe it's deeper. You sound dissatisfied. I'm not exactly satisfied. Northern allowed a little creepy grin. Admittedly, his smiles had improved after getting out of the rift, but this one suddenly felt off. Maybe he was trying too hard. Raven ignored his look and said, if you need knowledge on everything there is about a drifter and talents, there's no one else that can best me. I guarantee you that. That's rather arrogant of you. There's nothing arrogant about me. It's just plain truth. She cocked her head to the side, causing her black hair to tilt. Shall we move? Or do you want to have your lecture here? Chapter 139 Instructor Raven. Raven and Northern walked outside the castle as she began her explanation to him. She skipped the basics since Northern was already equipped with that knowledge, even though he had learned it the hard way. Some he had an idea of because of his mother, so he didn't need a thorough expansion. But others. Wait, so you're saying it's impossible to increase the class of talents? Raven glanced at him and nodded, then turned front as she continued walking. There's a reason talents are ranked into classes. She nodded a greeting as a young woman in ragged clothes passed by. Turning to Northern, she continued, talents, in their core, are a class. They determine the route to power a drifter takes. These classes are grouped into 3 basics: warrior, mage, and engineer. She nodded another greeting. The warriors, swordsmen, knights, archers, hand-to-hand combatants, Northern interrupted politely. Yes. And the mage class are drifters whose talents, without learning an art, give them abilities that can't be used with weapons and somehow overcome the limitation of distance. Then we have engineers, whose talents are great for utilities. Northern nodded in understanding. Ranking talents would have been against their stagnant nature. And since drifters didn't have a definitive classing system, talents were classed instead. I think I understand. Your talent class means your route to power and how efficient it is, which is supposed to be the grading. Then that grading is constant and cannot be changed. Raven nodded. It's nice to see you getting it. You're a natural. Thanks for the compliment. I guess. Crap, what exactly does this make me? If talent classes couldn't grow no matter how one tried, then didn't that make him one to be honored, a gem in this universe? I can evolve talent classes, make them better than they were. Of course, that was currently for himself alone, for now. And I can have multiple talents. In the long run, have multiple talent abilities. In a way, it could be said that I have multiple classes and may choose to be whatever I want. I could even have a different persona for each talent. Or I can decide which kind of fighter one want to be, a warrior today, maybe a mage tomorrow. Hell, I could even be an engineer if I wanted. The limitations placed on the copycat ability had made Northern not think too much about it. But in the long run, he was bound to eventually become the strongest being in RighteousFilth, or so he felt. I just need to be very delicate about the talents I copy. Are you okay, Lael? Raven's voice broke him out of his trailing thoughts. Northern frowned a little at the pristine lady beside him. I warned you about that. I'm sorry, North. His eyes stayed on her blankly for a couple of seconds. I didn't expect her to give in so easily. Next, we'll be talking about the state of things in this continent. Raven's voice trailed, helping Northern back to the main point. You might not know this, but the Dark Continent is the smallest of the 5 continents. You can remove 10 of it from the Central Plane, and the Central Plane still isn't be the biggest. Then why was it allowed to be a continent, even though it wasn't big? Northern inquired with an inquisitive frown. Because of Luiningard Empire. About 50 years ago, Luiningard submitted a petition to be recognized as their own continent. Before then, this used to be part of the Central Plane, although it's an island quite far away. She paused and looked at Northern to ensure he was listening, then added after observing his focused expression, it was situated at the northern edge of the Central Plains, to be exact. Northern looked at her for a couple of seconds, both their expressions gravely blank. Is she trying to make a jest of me with that face? Raven looked like an unfeeling robot, one incapable of changing facial expressions. She was flawlessly pretty, no doubt, but her face was stony, constant, and never changing. There were moments of small smiles, but they usually didn't last long and came once in a blue moon. They stood at the edge of the outer settlement, marked by a bridge that arched over a dried-out drainage system, a gutter of some sort. Raven leaned on the concrete frame and folded her arms as she resumed. Because of its power and influence, Luiningard was eventually granted permission by the Seven Kingdoms Council. Right, I know about that one. It's the Council of the Seven Kingdoms in the Central Plain that rose as a contingency measure to balance the growing of Reincarnated Empire. And Reincarnated Empire was the sole powerhouse of the Central Plain. If the Academy was one reason the Central Plains was adored and loved, Reincarnated was the other reason why it was hated and feared. Raven's voice trailed back into Northern's ears. After the permission was granted, 2 other vassal states emerged. This kingdom Lodaliwan and the Sand Nation of Sloria. Northern could roughly guess. Sand Nation, they're probably situated around the desert. Now, we don't know much, but we know that 2 nations were heavily affected by this disaster, Lodaliwan and Sloria. However, Sloria is doing quite well since they depend on Luiningard for everything. Food, clothes, weapons, everything gets shipped to them. But it's not as though they're in a much better condition. Their kingdom was ravaged too, and all that exists there is a stronghold of drifters that holds things together. I do think they have more drifters there than non-drifters. I see. Raven, I have a question. She loomed into Northern's eyes coldly and answered, ask. Why didn't Sloria, or the people from Lothalewin, just move to Luiningard? You said they were unaffected by the disaster. Wouldn't it be much safer, with the power of the Empire? They'll be able to fight the rifts and eventually win. Raven shook her head somberly, lingering before she responded. Luiningard Empire has walls as high as the academies. Their gates are locked to outsiders. No one has even seen what it's like on the inside. Everything is encased within a colossal wall. Northern nodded as her words sank in. Now I understand why Ellis needed my influence, thinking I was a prince from Luiningard. Northern raised his gaze again, his eyes folded with determination. Raven, I have one more question. Chapter 140. You'd be shocked. Raven silently consented for Northern to ask his question. She didn't say anything, merely looking at him as he opened his mouth. So, how are soul cores absorbed? Raven's eyes widened. For an expressionless being like her, this moment was priceless, deserving a space on a trophy shelf. Northern had managed to surprise her. A moment later, though, her widened eyes crumpled into a deep frown that made her crimson eyes radiate a deadly glow. Are you joking with me? Northern closed his eyes and made a polite smile, his hands behind his head. I'm so sorry, I didn't mean it that way. It's just that I'm quite inexperienced in a lot of things. Raven's frown lingered for 3 more seconds before she relaxed her face into its usual expression. You don't know. I don't know, Northern responded with a shy nod, still scratching the back of his head and trying to smile, which again looked awful on him. Raven stared silently, then blinked and started. Absorbing soul cores is simple. There is a general method which every drifter knows, common knowledge that is taught. However, several clans and nobles have managed to develop more potent methods, each fashioned to fit their body formation, battle style, and soul properties. So today, there are several methods used to absorb essence from soul cores, but I can guarantee you that all of them were developed from the general method. Northern nodded as she finished. Essence absorption had been one of his concerns, not because he was looking forward to absorbing soul essence one day. As far as things went, that was still impossible. But if there existed a slight way to increase the amount of void essence in his soul. It's just a presumption. I shouldn't expect too much from it. Northern discarded the thoughts and looked at Raven, as silvery voice rang. Can I continue my lectures now? He nodded to her with a stern facial expression, that of a student ready to devour every bit of knowledge their teacher had to offer. Raven continued, because Sloria and Luiningard act as though this disaster is none of their concern. Her facial lines creased into a scowl. The people of Lothalewin suffered the most damage and couldn't survive much. Their population was heavily affected. That's strange, though. Weren't Lothalewin supposed to be a vassal state of Luiningard? 2. You said that earlier. Raven raised a corner of her lips. Nice. He pays attention to details. The slight smirk disappeared before it could be noticed. Before the disaster, the king of Lothalewin was already defying the Empire and wanted to cut alliances with them. Northern raised a brow. Isn't that stupid? In a continent of only 3, they want to break away from the lordship of the strongest. Won't that lead to their ruin? He looked at Raven intently. I suppose the king wouldn't have just wanted to do that, except he had a backing. His thinking is intelligent too. Raven remarked inwardly. The past is no concern of ours. What matters is that because of this act, Lothalewin was completely abandoned, and its people were left to suffer. Eventually, they scattered everywhere and found safe havens in mountains and caves, managing to live away from monsters and continuing their lives. Northern turned to look at the ragged people of the outer settlement. He could see kids amidst them, some seated in front of their tents here and there. Then he looked back at Raven. I'm quite shocked that they still manage to reproduce even when faced with such horrors. Humans are one funny thing. Raven watched him keenly, as she had since the first day they met. He's mysterious, she thought, then continued. When we arrived, we had to settle somewhere. Going to the caves seemed like the best option, but it would have been a stupid idea. Because of the mentality ingrained, right? Northern continued, causing Raven to raise her eyes. If you had chosen to live with the native people and accepted their way of life, it would have been hard to leave or make the students leave. They probably have weak mentalities and are only thinking about survival. That would have offered them the best thing they were looking for: safety and comfort. A small smile made it to his lips and ran away half a second later, replaced by a fearsome glare as he went on. While those two things do sound like the best, they could be incredibly fatal. Because once they all get comfortable and safe, they'll abandon the idea of ever returning home. As long as there's food, they'll eventually continue living in this disaster and eventually forget it all. They'll just live like worthless nobodies, all because of fear, comfort, and safety. The surprise on Raven's face took longer to wipe off this time. I want him. Her eyes glittered. Perhaps, in all her life, Northern was the one person who had managed to amaze her so well. His thought pattern is so impressive. Raven had been unable to convince any of the students. It was useless. They couldn't see what she was doing when she told them to head to the capital of Lodaliwan and confront the monsters now that they had the strength. Luckily, Gilbert, Annette, and the twins were already there. With the presence of a sage, the students were eventually able to fight. And Gilbert also understood her point after much explanation. But Northern was different. She didn't even need to explain things to him. It was like, he was thinking the exact same way she was. But there's something I don't understand. If his thought is this efficient, why did he refuse to join the parties? Surely, he should have seen that this could be the best course of action for him. To Raven, Northern might be exceptional, but at the end, he was only a drifter, and there was so little he could do alone as a drifter. Northern needed people, she understood that fact too. If they wanted to conquer the rift or even return home, they needed each other. So, why was Northern excluding himself from the rest of them?